Just like with my flapper collection video, this is a collection of 1920s articles related to radio that I've read through in the past 2 years or so. This early period of radio is not generally known by most people outside of the academic world, but it was a fascinating and exciting time in the history of the medium, and I hope these articles help people understand it in more detail. I know that some people like to put on longer videos or podcasts while they do other things, and I've seen other YouTube creators make compilations of their own content before, so I'll do this from time to time. Anyway, enough of my yapping. Let's get into it. How I Listen In on the World by Radio by Armstrong Perry. Popular Science Monthly, November 1921. Up to the instant when I thrust a wire into the air and pulled down someone's jazz, I thought wireless was something like a fire extinguisher or a lifeboat, an emergency apparatus for a ship to use in case of accident, but of no immediate use to ordinary folks like myself. My great awakening to the romance of radio came when a friend of mine, who had the wireless hobby, urged me to purchase a cheap receiving set at an electric supply store. "What is the simplest wireless outfit that I can hear something with?" I asked. He surprised me with his answer. The simplest receiving set consists of an aerial, a detector, a phone shunted around the detector, and a ground wire. Except for the meaning of the words aerial, detector, and ground wire, I understood him perfectly. Seeing that I was in doubt, he went on to explain that wireless messages come through the air in electrical waves like ripples on a pond. The aerial, he said, was a wire put up in the air. The electrical waves washed against it, and some electricity trickled down to the detector. The detector, according to him, was a valve which let electricity go through in one direction but not in the other. The juice gathered by the aerial from the passing electrical waves was alternating current, called AC for short. It changed its direction of motion more times a second than the needle on a sewing machine. But the detector changed the current so that it went into the telephone in spurts, always moving in the same direction, like steam from an engine exhaust pipe. That was plain enough. Then he went on to add that all I had to do to shunt the phone around the detector was to hitch one of the two loose ends of the phone cord to one binding post of the detector, and the other loose end to the other binding post, and that I was then to hitch one binding post of the detector to any convenient water pipe by the shortest practicable piece of wire. This was my ground wire. The aerial wire was to be hitched to the other binding post, and then I should be all set to receive messages. This made two wires attached to each binding post of the detector of the wireless apparatus. The only adjustment I should have to make was on the detector. In this piece of apparatus, the tip of a small wire rested on the polished surface of a piece of galena, or lead ore. The galena, he said, was more sensitive in some spots than in others, just as a person is more ticklish on the bottoms of his feet than elsewhere. If what I heard was not loud enough, he said I should have to move the wire till I found a tickle spot. Within a few days after this conversation, I took home a complete radio receiver, which had cost me only a few dollars. On my way home, I began to feel ridiculous. Why should I, who knew nothing about such a mysterious and technical thing as wireless, expect that I could pick up messages from the air with a cheap outfit not bigger than a baseball? However, that evening, I brightened up the water pipe with a file, wrapped several turns of the ground wire around it, fastened it tight, and dropped on a bit of solder melted from an old tin can. Then I stapled the wire to the mopboard and brought the end up to the table where my detector and phone lay. There I made the connections according to instructions and put the receivers on my head. With one end of the aerial wire attached to the detector, I stepped out onto my sleeping porch with the coil. While figuring out where to anchor the outer end, I put up my hands to take hold of the galvanized iron pipes that supported the canvas roof. When the coil of wire in my hand touched the metal pipe, I nearly jumped out of my shoes, for right at my ears I heard jazz. That radio outfit couldn't wait for me to get the aerial up. It was using the porch frame. In the days that followed, I spent hours listening in. Sometimes I heard it by referring to a copy of the code, which had been given to me when I purchased my outfit. I tried the stunt one night and managed to translate this message. QST, 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 de NAH, NAH, NAH. Amateur broadcast. If you are interested in this broadcast, please advise by mail. United States Navy Radio Amateur Bureau, New York. At once, I wrote a letter saying that I was very much interested. In reply, I received a request to answer on an enclosed blank certain questions about myself and my station, and a promise that on receipt of the information, the Navy would send me a copy of certain secret codes used in sending out messages for amateurs. Promptly complying with the request, I was given a number as a registered amateur, and I soon began to recognize certain letters so readily that I could write them immediately, without going through the slower process of setting down dots and dashes and translating them later. Secret codes are made by substituting certain letters for others. For instance, where you receive an A, it may mean B, and so on. The key furnished by the Navy enables you to decode messages. One night, to my astonishment, I found my own name at the beginning of a message. Imagine the thrill with which I took out of the air a reply by the Navy Radio Amateur Bureau to a letter I had written them the day before. Let me tell you that it's the thrill of a lifetime when your government first communicates with you direct by wireless, and you get the message out of the air yourself. From then on, the Morse code came easily. Listening in on the standardized form of the weather forecast transmitted from naval stations was excellent practice. I soon found myself able to catch the concentrated digest of the world's news that is transmitted every evening. At first, I would wrestle for an hour, trying to piece together disconnected letters that I had grabbed out of the rapidly running procession. But at last, I came to a point where I could turn to the family during a 3-minute intermission and tell them what was going on in London, Tokyo, and Rio de Janeiro at the moment, and add the day's baseball scores. In the meantime, my station was growing. The first edition was a loose coupler. This is a tuning device. The simple outfit with which I started was as careless as a pup about what it brought in. If there was music, amateur traffic, and government business in the air at the same time, it brought them all to my listening ear, and it sounded like a Morse family quilting bee with everybody talking at once. The loose coupler, by a few simple adjustments, put out everybody except one person and locked the door. If I got tired of listening to that one, a simple twist of the wrist would put him out and bring in another. The practice end of radio was becoming so fascinating to me that I decided to learn something of the theory. I joined the YMCA class, and in less time than most men spend quarterly at the picture show, I had qualified for and received a government license as a radio operator. Then one day, I discovered the vacuum tube detector. It looks like an electric light, but when you hook it up, it yells like the barker outside a sideshow. A storage battery lights the filament just as in the case of an automobile lamp. A dry battery connects with the plate in the vacuum tube just as it would with the automobile's ignition system, although in this case there is no spark, just a noiseless flow of current. The knobs and switches which control the vacuum tube are all plainly marked. Within an hour, I was familiar with the different adjustments. While using my old apparatus, I had always been obliged to shush the family because the sounds which I heard were not loud enough to compete with their voices. But with my vacuum tube detector, the phone sometimes talked so loudly that I could hang it on a hook, lean back in my chair, and still hear everything distinctly. One winter's night, I was amusing myself by seeing how many different stations I could hear. I had purchased from the Superintendent of Documents, Government Printing Office, Washington, D.C., lists of all the amateur, commercial, and government ship and shore locations of the United States. Also, I had purchased from a private concern a list which included foreign ship and shore locations. One station, in calling another, gives the call letters of the station called, then the French word de, meaning from, and then its own call letters. By looking in the book, I could find out who was calling whom. The vacuum detector and the tuning outfit that went with it not only brought in all the stations I had been able to hear with the less efficient apparatus, but many more. The old apparatus seldom made audible any signals from stations more than 300 miles away, nor from those which sent out electrical waves that were more than 1,500 meters from crest to crest. The new receiver would bring in messages from much greater distances. I began with the lower wavelengths and several amateur stations and numerous ships of various nationalities. A number of these were sending QTE to NAH, the New York Naval Station. Freely translated, this means, "Where am I at?" None of these ships was lost, but their skippers knew that our government's radio compass stations at Fire Island, Sandy Hook, and Mantoloking can determine a ship's position night or day, in sun or storm, more accurately than her own navigator can. Raising my receiving wavelength, I heard successively Key West, Santiago de Cuba, Bermuda, and finally, at the upper limit of my tuning range, I was amazed to hear POZ in Nauen, a suburb of Berlin, talking with the Annapolis Naval Station. The simplicity of the thing was staggering. I was hearing a conversation across 5,000 miles of land and sea as easily as though it were in the next room. Recovering from my amazement, I started down the scale again. I had just reached 600 meters when a faint signal caught my ear. SOS. The skin tightened on my scalp as it did once when I was awakened in dead of night by a crash outside my window. Here was a tragedy of the seas being enacted within my hearing. I wrote down the call letters of the ship in distress, and the words, "on fire." At that moment, before I could catch her position, there came an interruption. Traffic from ship to shore often breaks out in bursts. Into the babel came a string of signals stronger than the rest. I tried to tune them out, but from my lowest wavelength to one far above that on which the SOS was coming, they were clear and strong. Pausing a moment to read the signals, I discovered that it was NAH repeating over and over again, QRT for SOS. Bluntly speaking, it meant, shut up until Uncle Sam gets a ship out of trouble. In 5 minutes, the ether was as silent as a deaf-mute asylum. Then, in tones that could be heard anywhere in the Atlantic, NAH tersely told the situation and gave directions. 3 ships nearest the one ablaze were detailed to go to her relief. Then, the broad interfering wave of the Navy station gave permission for the resumption of traffic. And so, every day, no matter when I listen in, my radio receiver brings me some item of thrilling interest from afar. It is not a passive sport, this radio game. With my transmitting apparatus, I can exchange messages with neighbors 5 to 10 miles away. And all the radio adventures that I am having, any man or woman, boy or girl, can duplicate. I began when I was past 40 and with only a few dollars worth of apparatus. With just my old mineral detector and single phone on July the 2nd, I heard a description of the Dempsey-Carpentier prize fight, blow by blow, given by an expert at the ringside. For this experience, I was indebted to the National Amateur Wireless Association, which served an area of 125,000 square miles with its radio phone reports. 1,000 mysteries of the air are open to the man who will buy a cheap radio receiver and begin. All the technical education he will need, he can pick up as he goes along. Even though his increasing interest leads him to purchase better and better apparatus, as I have, his hobby will cost him far less than the tobacco habit, and become not only a fascinating recreation, but a necessity as great as the daily paper. How to Write a Radio Play by Mildred Weinberger. Radio broadcast, April 1925. A radio play. What is it? Simply a play, comedy, tragedy, or whatnot, written directly for broadcasting. Its definition thus depends wholly on its purpose. A play which is primarily a radio play may of course be perfectly adaptable for presentation on the boards, the so-called legitimate theater, inasmuch as the differences between these two are not such as to make them mutually exclusive. It is the special play written for the microphone and received on radio sets in a multitude of homes that we are going to discuss. The question naturally arises, why should there be a special radio play? Legitimate plays have been broadcast before now, some of them with marked success. It is true that the number of plays open to choice for broadcasting is necessarily limited, and the whole number of plays large. Only certain types of plays are effective when so given, and only certain plays are sufficiently free of copyright and other strictures to be available. The whole question of broadcasting plays, which is agitating some of our theater managers at present, might be answered by keeping the two fields largely separate. Thus, a play which is running on Broadway may not be broadcast if the manager considers that his seat sale would be jeopardized. The program department of a radio station would not even be tempted to request to broadcast the play if there were plenty of other material to choose from. but the radio audience does like plays. To write a play for broadcasting, one must remember that your play gets over through the ear alone. There will be no costumes, settings, makeup, or properties to assist in putting it across. Simple settings, costumes, and properties can be described by the radio announcer. Many interruptions of the action of the play for interpolated directions weaken its effect. Therefore, we have a list of things to do and another of things not to do in writing a play for radio broadcasting. What are the positive requirements to make our radio play effective? First, keep the cast simple. Have only a few characters, so that your audience will not forget them and be confused as to which one is speaking. Then, when you name your people, use names which are clear in sound. Remember how some names are easy to get over the telephone and others have to be repeated 5 or 6 times before you understand who is speaking. If you are blessed with one of those difficult names and call up a department store or telephone a telegram, you will know all about that. Your patience is gone before the matter is even comprehended at the other end. So call your people by names which come clearly to the ear. Then too, each name must be distinct from every other one. Sue and Prue would not be a good choice for 2 women characters in the same play. When you can see who is speaking, there is no doubt in the matter, but our radio audience can distinguish only by its ears. A crowd is never useful in a broadcast play, unless you wish merely an effect of confusion. If the idea is to represent a background of conversation, it can be done very well with perhaps 2 voices, those of important characters, coming out of it. One must be careful not to risk confusion in the lines of important characters. If 3 or more people try to talk at once, even at very close intervals, so as to give an effect of eagerness, excitement, or whatnot, the author of a radio play runs a strong chance of merely blurring the speeches. In a radio play, the speech and the speaker should at all times be easily recognized by the sounds going out. It might be helpful also to use the name of the character addressed more often than necessary in a stage play. For example, Joe and Harry meet. Joe: "Well, Harry, how's the boy?" Harry: "First rate, Joe. How's the world treating you?" Joe: "Oh, so-so. I've had a pretty raw deal from Mamie. Did you hear?" Harry: "Why, no, Joe. That's too bad." The hearer is never in doubt about which radio character is speaking. Of course, the actors in a radio play will be selected principally for their voices, so that the voice of each character is recognized as distinct from every other one. But it never hurts to make assurance doubly sure. Without the use of the eye, some of us are surprisingly helpless. Have you ever noticed how comparatively few people can recognize which of their friends is talking over the telephone? Then there is the question of the actual words of your speeches. Use simple and direct English. Make the speeches short enough to be comprehended at one hearing. Do not use dialect, which is often difficult to follow, even where the speaker is visible, and over the telephone it is very confusing. That means eliminate the humorous Irish brogue, the colored mammy, the Scotch, and various other tempting type parts. Also, it is better judgment and better taste not to use slang, or the curtailed and often grossly incorrect English of the pedestrian. Good English can be learned through the theater, as many settlement dramatic organizations will affirm. The radio program is especially effective in this field because it comes so directly into the home, and because it has so many young listeners, many of whom like to be in style with the latest colloquialisms at the expense of a real knowledge of their own language. When it comes to the story of the play, give enough in the actual words of your speeches so that the physical activity of the characters is clear. If one man were trying to get something from another, for instance, he might say, "Give that to me, or I will tear it from you." The answer is, "Over my dead body." A third voice cries, a woman's, "Don't fight! Oh, you are hurting him!" The first man exclaims, "I have it!" Now we know what has taken place without seeing a thing. There can, of course, be simple sounds put in by the property man, such as the shutting of a door, a pistol shot, a bell ringing, the thump of a falling body. The simplest and clearest of these actions can be explained by words in a radio play without being redundant. In general, words must take the place of what would be pantomime in a stage play. This leads to an interesting development, the use of the soliloquy, which has been out of date in the legitimate drama for several decades. The soliloquy must represent in the radio play what an actor is feeling, where he could show this to his audience by the working of his face, his hands, his general movements, if our eyes could see him. Still, we are out of patience with the long soliloquy, which is merely a stilted recitation. When a man talks to himself, it should therefore be natural in the play and in the character. People who are much alone often do talk to themselves. Under the stress of emotion, anyone may exclaim aloud, and so the cases multiply. But the soliloquy in the radio play must serve a double purpose. It must continue the action, audibly, while any character is on the stage alone. We must hear what he is doing. It would seem, besides all this, as though the radio play ought to be kept at a constant pitch of emotion. That is, the characters should be highly involved, emotionally, as much of the time as possible. There is something very effective in the quiet spaces of a stage play, filled with color, light, dramatic pauses, when our eyes are taken with the picture and our interest held. But not so in the broadcast play. We cannot see. This fact cannot be too much emphasized, because it is at the root of the whole difference between the radio pool and any other sort. Our interest has but one medium to sustain it here. If we are bored, we retune the radio set and pick up some other station. The radio playwright can only hold his audience by sustaining constantly the movement, the emotion of the story in the play. All of this has to go into the speeches, the words of the actors. It is advisable to make the radio play short and so avoid tiring the audience. This opens delightful fields for the playwright. Try to interest a Broadway manager in a play which runs less than 2 hours. Try to make him consider even a 2-act play. Yet here in the broadcasting of plays, we are free. Why not write that 2-act play which has been bothering you this long while, and try it on the radio? There are many delightful situations which naturally fall into just this division of time or place, but unfortunately, we know they will have no Broadway market in the 2-act form. So we try to fatten them, and spread them, and pull them out of proportion, much to our own grief and theirs. Another delightful prospect is that of freedom in the choice of setting. The most fantastic, the most extravagant set that the imagination can devise is nothing to the disadvantage of your play. All you have to do is describe it in words, and the announcer in the radio station will read them and create the scene. There should then be a field here for many a good play which offers obstacles to a Broadway production. The apparent rivalry between the stage play and radio broadcasting seems, on these grounds, not so formidable. As a matter of fact, many a play which is scoring a great success in the theater would not be good at all sent out from a radio station. Take What Price Glory, a most stirring experience on the regular stage. What would the second act be if we could only hear it? Take away the dugout, the dim light, the makeup of the men, and you have a series of disjointed recitations, with all that grim significance gone. And the last act wouldn't be there at all. But how tremendously it is there at the Plymouth Theater. Conversely, however, the fact that a play is effective on a radio program does not prohibit its stage success. Perhaps it has never had a hearing, and what better hearing could it possibly have than this, to be broadcast far and wide? It should be very possible to rewrite many plays originally intended for stage production so that they will suit the peculiar demands of broadcasting very well. It has been suggested that a moving picture scenario offers greater possibilities, but this does not seem likely. The moving picture appeals to the eye almost as exclusively as the radio play reaches the ear. It is written in terms of pantomime, which is the very thing impossible to represent over a studio microphone. Its story is based on physical action and the possibility of effective visual drama. The radio play must make its pictures audible. Everything needful to the furtherance of the story must be told in the lines. Thus, only slight changes or additions to an existing stage play might make it a good radio vehicle, while rewriting the story of a movie would mean writing a whole new play. Why, in any case, borrow from pre-existing fields when new horizons open? Why not create a body of dramatic literature primarily intended for this specific purpose, the radio play? Out of the Studio Broadcasting by William H. Easton, Ph.D., Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. Radio broadcast, March 1923. The outstanding feature of broadcasting during the present season is the large number of out-of-the-studio events that are being broadcasted by some of the larger stations through wire connections direct from the scene of action. Prominent among the events that have thus been given to the radio audience are the World Series baseball games and championship football contests, boxing matches, organ recitals, symphony concerts and grand opera, plays, banquets and civil exercises, addresses by famous men, church services, and even a message of the President to Congress. To say that the radio audience appreciates programs of this sort is to put it mildly. Even the dyed-in-the-wool DX amateur admits that now there is something in broadcasting. Broadcasting is in fact entering into the third stage of its development. In the first stage, the phonograph is the main reliance. Practically all broadcasting stations started at this point, and many have never gotten beyond it. Phonographic programs are simple and inexpensive. No special equipment is required except the actual transmitter, and no staff except the operators. A friendly music dealer who hands out a dozen or so records every day in return for the mention of his name and address in the ether provides the bulk of the entertainment. In the second stage of development, artists in person form the chief attraction. This is a greater step in advance than most listeners realize. First of all, there must be a place for the artist to perform in. The ordinary transmitting room is utterly unsuitable for such purposes, so that a studio must be provided. This studio should be well furnished. It must contain a piano and other musical instruments, and it ought to be made soundproof and free from echoes. There must also be a competent staff to engage and receive the several thousand artists utilized every year by a station in daily operations. And finally, there should be a musical director to select voices and arrange well-balanced programs. All this involves a good-sized organization and considerable expense. It was the studio that transformed broadcasting from a curiosity into a national institution of culture. By providing the proper accommodations, it made possible the transmission of solos and speeches of every description, concerts by full bands, orchestras, and choruses, and even oratorios and condensed operas. But its resources are not inexhaustible. After a program manager has staged 3 or 4 different events every night for a year or so, he finds that he is milling around in a circle. His programs have become monotonous, even in their extreme variety, and real novelties are almost unobtainable. Then, those stations in a position to do so take the third step and go out of the studio for their chief features. An immense field is thus opened up, especially for stations located in large cities, since experiments show that practically anything that is audible can be broadcasted in this manner. The use of wires to reach outside events originated with KDKA, the Westinghouse station at East Pittsburgh. As early as January 1921, this station broadcasted services direct from Calvary Church, Pittsburgh, and in the same month it sent out a speech by Secretary Hoover from the Duquesne Club of that city. A few weeks later, it transmitted a boxing contest direct from Duquesne Gardens, and the radio audience heard for the first time the shouts and applause of the spectators at an athletic event. In the following year, KYW, Chicago, made notable use of wire connections by broadcasting almost every performance of the Chicago Opera Company. This year, about a dozen other stations are undertaking this highest grade of service. The list will probably never be a long one because highly special apparatus and expert operators are needed for this work. In addition, the cost of installing and renting the necessary wires is high. It is no easy matter to broadcast out of the studio events successfully. In the studio, everything is under the control of the manager, and all speakers and artists can be arranged with reference to the microphone. Outside, however, the broadcaster has no control, and he must arrange his transmitting apparatus to suit the messages to be transmitted. This means a very careful study of each location. What are the acoustic properties of the scene of action? Will there be speakers? If so, how many? Where will they be? What sort of voices will they have? Is there much extraneous noise? If so, is it to be broadcasted as with applause or eliminated? Are there any special noises that are particularly wanted, as with the gong at a prize fight? What sort of music will there be? Is it to be orchestral, organ, piano, or choral? Will there be solos? Is there to be great variation in the volume of music? All of these questions and many more must be correctly answered, and arrangements to cover every possible contingency must be made in advance. For there is little opportunity to make changes during the broadcasting, and every detail of the event must be transmitted perfectly, or else the radio audience will protest most vigorously. The most complicated event to broadcast is an Episcopal church service, owing to the number of places from which the minister speaks, and the great variations in the volume and character of the music. A brief description of the method used by the Westinghouse Radio Corporation station WJZ to broadcast the services of St. Thomas's Church, 5th Avenue and 53rd Street, New York, will serve to illustrate how problems of this sort are solved. 9 microphones are used in this installation, located as follows. In the anteroom, where the opening and closing prayers are said, on the pulpit for the sermon, on the lectern for the service prayers, on the reading desk for the lessons, on the altar rail for the creed and other parts of the service, on the altar for the communion prayers, near the organ for the organ voluntaries, in the chandelier for the choir, and in a place that is out of the way but still commands a view of the service for the radio announcer and operator. All of these microphones are connected to a little switchboard controlled by the radio operator. He also has a small cabinet providing 3 stages of amplification, connected with the wire line to the station and supplied with energy from a storage battery. A receiving set which tells him what is going on in the ether, and a telephone line to the station complete his equipment. During the service, the operator is a busy man. He must not only switch on the proper microphone to transmit whatever is happening at the moment, but he must constantly change the degree of amplification to correspond with changes in the volume of the sound. To do this without producing abrupt crashes of sound in the listener's receiver, or the even more disturbing breaks in the continuity of the service, requires a great deal of skill and quick judgment. Other installations provide other problems. When arrangements were being made to broadcast Clemenceau's speech at the Hotel Pennsylvania, for example, it was found that the tiger always walked around when he spoke, so that no single microphone could catch all he said. Investigation showed, however, that the speaker would be confined to a narrow aisle formed between the long table at which he was to sit and the wall. A string of 12 microphones, concealed in the decorations, was placed on this table, and as Clemenceau paced up and down, the operator followed his movements by switching on one microphone after another. At football games, there is generally a microphone for the announcer, placed high up in the stands where a good view can be obtained, and 2 in the field, each opposite a student section, for the cheers and songs. Some difficulty was experienced in making the announcer heard over the uproar, especially during critical plays, and the latest practice is to place him in a soundproof booth. Theatrical plays are especially difficult to broadcast, because the actors move over so large an area and have voices of such different qualities. Furthermore, the microphones can be located only in the footlights, wings, and prosceniums, and not directly on the stage where they should be. These difficulties are even greater in the case of grand opera, where the stage is apt to be much larger, and the variation in tone much wider. The chief value of out-of-the-studio broadcasting lies in the possibility of securing events that cannot be staged in the studio. But there is also another factor that is important, namely the atmosphere of life that is transmitted. The artist or speaker in the studio is addressing a silent audience. When he indulges in humor, there is no laughter. When he scores a point, there is no sign of approval. And when he finishes, there is no applause. But when the affair is broadcasted in the presence of a real audience, both the speaker or artist and the radio audience feel the difference. The great difficulty with outside broadcasting is the poor acoustic conditions that are often encountered. Proper location of the microphone will sometimes remedy the worst defects, but there is usually a great deal of echoing and extraneous noises. The best artistic results will therefore always be obtained in the well-designed studio, until, which is more than likely to happen, theaters, churches, auditoriums, and other public places are specifically designed with reference to broadcasting. Another difficulty is that, owing to the time schedules on which most stations operate, it is often necessary to close down in the middle of an interesting outside event. This always vastly irritates the radio audience, but it is never the fault of the stations doing the broadcasting. They always endeavor to obtain extension of time from the stations scheduled to follow them, but if this is refused, they have no option but to cut off. The remedy is obviously to give a free hand to those stations who are earnestly engaged in improving the quality of broadcasting. This development of broadcasting still further emphasizes the difference between the better and the poorer stations. The Chicago Grand Opera, as broadcasted from KYW twice a week, could be heard over 9/10 of the United States on a single stage of amplification, provided there was no local interference. As it is, probably only a small proportion of the radio audience can hear much of this really great undertaking, except a few snatches now and then between the lulls of local jazz and other trivialities. Stations that are doing creative, worthwhile work earn their places in the ether. But too many stations are unable to do more than weakly imitate the poorest efforts of the leaders, and do actual injury to broadcasting by interference, and by occupying time that could be applied to better advantage. The radio audience, in fact, does not know what it is losing. How many first-class events are not scheduled by the larger stations simply because their time schedules do not permit them to do all they would like to do? Opinions about the Jazz Age in Radio. Radio broadcast, April 1925. Of late, some of the saxophone specialists and some of the leaders of jazz orchestras heard over the radio have risen up in wrath, and in letters couched in unmistakable terms, have accused the conductor of this department of trying to put all the jazz players in the country out of their jobs, and especially to condemn every saxophone player to eternal obscurity. It has been interesting to receive these letters. Adverse criticism as well as laudatory criticism can be a tonic, but to be a tonic it must strike with truth at the core of the subject criticized. In this, every letter so far received protesting against this department's attitude toward the broadcasting of jazz has failed to make its point. For every letter has brought the accusation that we have unremittedly condemned, wholesale, all jazz and all jazz players. Now, first, let it be said that the conductor of this department does not especially enjoy jazz. If it is so-called artistic jazz, about all you get out of it is to listen to distortions of the masterpieces of music, the great operatic arias, the immortal songs. If it is the sort of jazz that plays the latest popular hits, it is pretty nearly unspeakable in our opinion. Although not an admirer of any sort of jazz, it would be far from consistent or fair for us to make a sweeping condemnation of this form of music. By certain jazz specialists, it has been raised to what is, of its kind, an art. If it is the sort of art you enjoy, it is your full right to hear as much of it as you desire. If you don't enjoy it, yours is the privilege to say so. Here is a list of the jazz orchestras that have received honorable mention in this department since it opened in April 1924. In every instance, a photograph of the organization mentioned was published. Vincent Lopez and his Hotel Pennsylvania Orchestra. Harvey Marburger and his Keith Vaudeville Entertainers, Café L'Aiglon, Philadelphia. The Campus Serenaders of the Rensselaer Polytechnic School, Troy, New York. Perry and Russell, two-man singing orchestra. Paul Speck's Hotel Alamac Orchestra, New York. Also was published a photograph of William Menzer and his musical saw. We confess that the musical saw has a weird and haunting fascination for us. And as for the steel guitars, they stand high in our regard as radio entertainers. Have you noticed what good music you hear when they are programmed? They produce music played, generally, with fine taste. Indeed, there are precious few violinists heard over the radio who can come within sight of these guitar players in musical taste or technical achievement. It is not against legitimate jazz or any of the musical features that cannot be ranked as classical and yet are good that this department is fighting. What we are out to kill completely and forever is the sort of broadcasting described in masterly fashion by Dr. R.S. Minard of Erie, Pennsylvania, who writes in a letter recently received from him after uttering a hearty amen to all that has been said in this department against radio programs. Night after night, when I get home after a hard, long day, I don't feel like tuning in and tuning out half a dozen stations, each of which inquires in squally, squeaky, uncanny saxophone wails, what's become of Sally? Who of all the millions of musicians and musically inclined listeners in the world ever cares a hang where that fool Sally is, or anything else about her except to regret that hers was not a stillbirth? Or who's going to follow the swallow to find where's my sweetie hiding? And red hot mama is such a beautifully endearing term to screech into the ear of one whose tenderest memories are those of mother. I have tuned in the same station several times each evening, only to hear that someone has just wired or phoned a request for another repetition of one of those soulless assemblages of noise which has already been played several times the same evening. The radio audience certainly is not composed wholly of morons. There are perhaps as large a number of those who appreciate music as there are persons whose musical appreciation wallows in the depths of the muck and mire. And it is an outrage that stations which are trying to broadcast music must realize that their efforts come to naught because some near high-powered station persists in profaning the very air with their senseless confusion. I am expressing the feelings of a host of radio enthusiasts among my friends when I say what I have said. Dr. Minard does not by a word exaggerate the condition that prevails, a few stations excepted, all over the country from about 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Where does the fault lie? Well, all will agree that the programs from a broadcasting station cannot rise higher than the intelligence of the program director. The remedy? It can be found only in the owners of broadcasting stations. When they see to it that their stations are run intelligently, we shall have programs that can command our respect, but not until then. It is the public that must make the owners of broadcasting stations see that they are playing a losing game. And this can be done only by putting up a loud and never-ending protest against present conditions. Judging from the letters that come to this department, this protest will soon gain such momentum and volume as to cause a sudden and devastating explosion somewhere. Travelers hear Station RR. Pennsylvania Lines installs system to inform and entertain passengers in Philadelphia waiting room. Broad service may follow. By K.D. Pulsifer, editor of the Pennsylvania News. Radio Digest, July 7th, 1926. Scene: waiting room of a Metropolitan Railroad station a few years hence. Broadcasting studio seen through a window from the main waiting room. Loudspeakers placed about big room convenient for 1,000 or more passengers. Announcer at mic. Ladies and gentlemen, while we are waiting for the Pullman boys to get sleepers ready for the Nighthawk Express to Chicago, we will listen to a few Negro melodies by the George Brothers of Georgia. 4 white-jacketed colored men may be seen through the transom taking their position before the microphone. Soon, the vast waiting room is resonant with their voices intermingled with strains from banjos and guitars. The singers finish one song and then another. People come in from the street until every seat is filled. The big waiting room is transformed into an auditorium. The announcer steps again to the microphone. His voice is heard from the loudspeakers. 20 minutes before the Nighthawk sleepers are ready. I have some very good news. Mr. Tito Kersey, the famous tenor of the Metropolitan Opera, has just come into the station on his way to Chicago and has consented to sing for you. The great artist is observed removing his overcoat, and a moment later he is heard, and his golden voice thrills the audience that now nearly fills the station, for it happens that nearly every evening now some celebrity may be depended on to be heard in this station. Sometimes a program may be heard brought in from a distant broadcasting station. Is this mere fancy? No, sir, it is not. The idea was conceived some time ago by J.O. Hackenberg, superintendent of the Philadelphia Terminal Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad. In a modified form, it already has been installed in the Broad Street station of that line in Philadelphia. John R. Harper, an employee of the railroad whose voice has been heard from various of the local broadcasting stations, was selected to announce and direct. The expressions of surprise and satisfaction on the part of the waiting passengers seemed to warrant all that had been hoped for. K.D. Pulsifer, editor of the Pennsylvania News, was asked to prepare the following report of the experiment. A miniature broadcasting system is now being used with marked success for train announcing by the Pennsylvania Railroad in Broad Street Station, Philadelphia. An experimental test made several weeks ago in which temporary equipment was used clearly demonstrated the advantages of broadcasting train announcements as compared with the former method, which involved train callers who used megaphones. When it became apparent as the result of experiment that greatly improved service could be provided for travelers, arrangements were made immediately to install a regular broadcasting apparatus. Instead of being hooked up with an aerial like a radio broadcasting station, this equipment is connected by wires with the various loudspeakers throughout the station. The chief features of the apparatus are a microphone, amplifying mechanism, and a total of 27 loudspeakers, which are distributed in clusters on 4 pillars in the concourse and also in the waiting rooms and the dining room. A special compartment, glass enclosed and containing the microphone and other necessary transmission apparatus, was built for the announcer between the doors to the main waiting room in the center of the concourse. The apparatus builds up and amplifies the human voice, and as a result, the announcer's words can be heard distinctly in the concourse and in all other parts of the station covered by loudspeakers. Although the use of the broadcasting system for train announcing is an innovation in itself, a popular feature in regard to the way it is used also has been developed. The announcer does more than merely recite the timetable. He talks to the public immediately following the announcement of specific trains, and in addition broadcasts weather reports and news items relating to Pennsylvania Railroad affairs or to important current events. He also frequently tells passengers boarding a particular train about historical places or scenic spots through which the train will pass. The announcer is constantly in touch with the chief dispatcher, and in case of interruptions in the service, he immediately passes the information on to waiting patrons. Besides, the announcer puts a personal or humorous touch in his remarks when the chance offers. A wedding party inspired this greeting. To the bride and bridegroom at gate number 12, about to start on their honeymoon, we extend our hearty congratulations. You are starting right and starting over the Pennsylvania Railroad. May your other journeys through life be made with the same wisdom. The announcing system is in operation daily from 8 a.m. until midnight, and is under the general supervision of W.R. Jones, station master. J.O. Hackenberg, superintendent of the Philadelphia Terminal Division, conceived the idea of broadcasting train announcements and put it into effect. A church with a mighty congregation. Pastor M.E. Dodd of the First Baptist Church, Shreveport, Louisiana, who installed a radio broadcasting station so that his aged mother 400 miles away could hear him preach, is reaching thousands of radio enthusiasts. By Archie Richardson. Radio broadcast, August 1922. When the first radio services were held one Sunday in May in the new $500,000 building of the First Baptist Church of Shreveport, Louisiana, but a small portion of the worshipers were found in the church auditorium. The rest of the congregation were scattered throughout the United States, in portions of Mexico and Upper South America, on the islands of the Gulf of Mexico, and in ships at sea. One of the country's most powerful radio broadcasting stations carried the pastor's voice through the hundreds of miles that lay between him and his hearers. In hundreds of churches served by circuit riders, in hospital wards, in orphanages and old people's homes, and in residences of those affiliated with this church, receiving sets are being installed to take advantage of the opportunities offered by the first powerful radio broadcasting station in this part of the country. A 200-watt set using a powerful motor generator and operated by a licensed commercial operator was used. The station sends out on a 360-meter wavelength. The call number has not yet been assigned. The station is located in the 10-story tower of the church. The antennas are suspended between the top of the tower and a 30-foot skeleton steel tower built on an office building across the street. They consist of 4 copper wires, 125 feet in length, 100 feet above the ground. It was planned to broadcast the dedicatory services on Sunday, April 22nd, but part of the equipment failed to arrive in time to be installed before these services. The normal radius of the station is 300 miles, but under favorable conditions, it can be picked up from coast to coast and is audible in portions of South America. The broadcasting feature of the new church plans was arranged primarily in order that the aged and invalid mother of the pastor might hear the sermons of her son. At her home in Trenton, Tennessee, nearly 400 miles away, a receiving set has been installed in her bedroom, and daily it will bring to her the voice of her son. Mrs. Lucy Williams Dodd, the mother of the pastor, Dr. M.E. Dodd, is nearly 80 years old, and for the last 2 years has grieved because she could not hear his sermons. While Dr. Dodd was visiting her recently, she expressed the fear that she would never hear him preach again. That was the suggestion that led to the installation of the broadcasting station. He made her a promise that arrangements would be made so that she would hear every service he conducted as plainly as if she were sitting in a pew before him. For a long time, Mrs. Dodd was skeptical. The retired life her illness has forced her to lead in late years has caused her to lose touch with many of the world's developments. But her son reminded her that when telephones first came into general use, she had said she would have none of them in her home. She consented to a trial, and a radio set was installed in her home. Now, she is an enthusiastic radio fan. Daily, she listens to concerts and lectures sent out from broadcasting stations, and enthusiastically declares that the newfangled ideas aren't so bad after all, especially for a woman of 80 who can scarcely leave her bed. And now the completion of the station in the Shreveport church has enabled her to listen to the voice of her own son. Hundreds of churches that have no pastor or that are able to have a preacher only once or twice a month have installed or are planning to install receiving sets. Now that this church station has been completed, they will have services twice every Sunday and throughout the week as regularly as the city church. And they will have the same sermons and the same music that the people of the biggest Baptist church in the world enjoy. It is stated that half of the Baptist churches of Louisiana are without pastors. The same is true of many other states. These churches are in small towns and in neighborhood settlements, in many cases off the railroads. Bad roads make many of them inaccessible through a large portion of the year. That the church radio will be a boon to the isolated congregation is agreed by all religious workers. Many preachers declare that radio offers the church bigger opportunities than anything science has produced since the invention of the printing press. Some say that it ranks above the printing press in importance. The rural church, long a neighborhood gathering place, will take on greater importance as a civic, educational, and cultural center as a result of the installation of radio. People will gather at the church evenings throughout the week, as well as on Sundays, to hear the best in music and lectures, to receive market reports, to get the day's news, and to hear the many other things offered by the country's broadcasting stations. But radio will not take the place of the pastor of the small church, according to almost unanimous verdict of church leaders. They say the personal touch of the individual minister cannot be supplanted by the radio service. They regard it as supplementing his work and offering him opportunities for bigger work rather than substituting for him. Many a church has fallen apart through lack of a pastor because there was no reason for the congregation to assemble. The radio is expected to remove this condition of affairs. Aside from the religious services, many features will be broadcasted by the Shreveport church station. The auditorium, the largest in the city, has been offered as a civic and educational center. The world's greatest singers and lecturers will be heard there, and their concerts and lectures will be available to all who have receiving sets. On the 9th floor of the church tower is a 13-bell chime, of which the largest bell weighs 3,000 pounds. Daily concerts are given by a trained chimer. A chime connection makes the broadcasting of these concerts a simple matter. Recitals on the 4-manual organ of the church, together with choir and congregational singing, will be features of the program. A daily news service is being arranged for. The pastor states that the performance of marriage ceremonies will be one of the tasks of his radio station. A marriage performed by radio is just as legal, and the ceremony can be as impressive as if the minister were present in person, he says. This, it is pointed out, will permit a couple to have their wedding solemnized by the minister of their choice who may be hundreds of miles away. The only thing in the way of a ceremony of this kind seen by Dr. Dodd is the tendency of the bridal couple to arrive late, but he thinks a way can be found to get around this. The pastor expects to reach many of his flock who are addicted to Sunday morning automobile trips through his radio outfit. He will insist that when they go out Sunday morning, they carry receiving sets in their cars. There is only one fly in the ointment for the pastor. He is much concerned over the fact that a bed spring makes a splendid aerial. Much of his work, he says, is to get members of his flock out of bed in time for Sunday school or even the morning preaching service. When the people learn that they can listen to the services by attaching the receiving set to their bed springs, he fears there will be a growing tendency to lie abed Sunday mornings. The matter of collections isn't worrying him, he says. While it is impossible to pass the collection plate around with his congregation scattered over 48 states, he says that just as effective means will be devised for financing the activities of the church. The broadcasting station is but one of the unusual features found in this church, which is declared to be one of the most remarkable church plants in the world. A 10-story tower which furnishes quarters for a Sunday school of 3,000 and many young people's societies has attracted much attention. The 4 floors of the main building, together with the tower, have a total floor space of 51,500 square feet and a combined seating capacity of 8,000 people. The main auditorium will seat 3,000 people. It is equipped with a 4-manual organ and a chime connection. The transmitter of the broadcasting outfit is inconspicuously located in the pulpit and connected with the generator by wires that run under the floor and up the elevator shaft. Even the deaf will be provided for in this auditorium. An Acousticon outfit has been installed with a transmitter in the pulpit, connecting by concealed wires with the pews. The roof garden provides accommodation for 1,000 people. During the summer, outdoor services, concerts, and socials will be held there. The nursery in the basement, fitted up with toys, sand piles, and children's furniture under the supervision of a nurse, cares for children of mothers attending services or working or shopping downtown during the week. The dining rooms furnish noon lunches daily to several hundred girls and women employed downtown. Several banquets are served every week. The banquet hall seats 500 people at 2 long tables. A gymnasium is located in an upper room of the tower. The congregation of this church numbers 2,200. 10 years ago, its membership was 500. While the city has shown a growth of 43%, the membership of the church has increased 400%, while the contributions of the church to all causes has increased 3,000%. Meet J. Andrew White, the most famous announcer in radio, by Myra May. Radio broadcast, October 1924. Several years ago, a worried young business executive sat in his office and considered his hard lot. Business was rotten. The slump of 1921 had hit the sales of every concern, but had been particularly hard on the few existing radio companies. The worried young business executive, Major J. Andrew White, lit a cigarette and idly picked up the morning newspaper. His eye was immediately attracted to an account of the forthcoming Dempsey-Carpentier fight. It was the topic of conversation everywhere. As Major White read the preliminary story of the bout, he had a sudden idea. Nightly for months, he had been experimenting with radio telephone reception from the 3 low-power Pioneers, which were droning 1, 2, 3, 4, and grinding out scraps of phonograph music. He had speculated often on the possibilities of introducing radio telephony to the nation at large, but an important event was needed for that introduction. This whole country has become interested in the Dempsey-Carpentier fight, Major White reasoned. Now why can't my radio be tied up with it? Why can't I send this fight broadcast? There were only about 1,000 objections to this brilliant idea. Few dreamed the broadcasting was possible. Even if they did, they knew that July, a month of bad static, would be a dangerous month to experiment on a large scale. Everyone who thought of it at all felt that the limited day range of wireless was so small that the signals would not travel far enough to make broadcasting then worthwhile. And no one would put up the money to try out his quixotic scheme. At least $15,000 was necessary to build the high towers and install a station at Boyle's 30 acres in New Jersey, where the fight was to take place. "You're crazy," Major White's friends told him. His enemies said the same thing behind his back. Nevertheless, entirely on his own initiative, he began to work out plans for transmitting the fight round by round to skilled receiving operators, mostly amateurs, throughout the country. At this time, Major White was acting president of the National Amateur Wireless Association. To pick up the Dempsey-Carpentier encounter, he selected certain members of the association, perhaps 250 in all, who would secure halls or theaters, hook up their sets, install loudspeakers, and give the crowds the chance of hearing the fight direct from the ringside. When I approached the Radio Corporation of America for an appropriation for my foolhardy plan, no one was particularly anxious to be identified with my scheme, much less to contribute to it. But there was one man, David Sarnoff, who was willing to give me a chance. Through his influence, the company gave me $1,500 for my gamble, Major White confides. With that precious $1,500, I started on a career of frenzied finance. You've heard of that farmer who made 2 blades of grass grow where one grew before? Well, his work was child's play next to mine. My simple little task was to make $15,000 grow where $1,500 had grown. In reconnoitering Boyle's 30 acres for the best place to build my station, I saw the radio towers of the Lackawanna Railroad reared high over the surrounding country. In a flash, I saw my station. I finally secured permission from the railroad company to use their towers on July the 2nd. My next difficulty was that I had no transmitter. But such a little detail did not worry me. In casting around among the electric companies, I located a continuous wave ship transmitter at the General Electric Laboratory in Schenectady. Then I hunted up a kind friend who owned a tug, and he promised to bring the General Electric set down the river to Hoboken. Just about this time, when everything seemed to be going nicely, some of our amateur operators got stage fright. The number diminished steadily, and out of 250 prospective agents, our loyal band had shrunk to about 90. The day of the fight was only about 10 days off. I had been working night and day since April, getting everything in readiness. Associated with me were 4 men who devoted as much time to my foolhardy plan as I did. Chief among them was J.O. Smith, now of the sales force of the Radio Corporation. Interest in the broadcasting of the fight had at last been awakened. Our office force was swamped with telephone calls and a steady stream of telegrams. We were still in doubt as to whether we would even get the space for our transmitter, but we proceeded along the supposition that we would. Fortunately, about a week before the fight, the railroad company turned over to us the end of a hallway in a railroad yard building, and there we installed our improvised station. Our amateur receiving operators were scattered in different cities from Maine to Washington, D.C., and as far west as Pittsburgh. These men showed fine courage. They took large assembly halls and secured loudspeakers. At that time, phonograph horns were our most up-to-date loudspeakers. Smith and I worked after office hours until about 2 or 3 in the morning, testing our set. Announcements were sent to our operators to be in readiness for the tests, and then to telegraph us what they heard. The results were discouraging. Their return messages told us of the few scattered words that had been audible, and indicated that our fight broadcasting would be equally unsatisfactory. But things couldn't continue this way. Our luck must change. It did. Our set began to work the night before the fight. Smith and I were worn out from lack of sleep and worry over the event. It had seemed that every imaginable objection had been put in our path. The 11th hour, however, brought the final objection that threatened to ruin our whole project and send it into failure. The American Telephone and Telegraph Company refused to allow us to connect our radio set to a land wire from Boyle's 30 acres to Hoboken, where our station was located. That was too much. This was the end, I thought. Then I took fresh courage. I couldn't back down at the last minute and disappoint the operators who were counting on my support. After some frantic scrambling around, I at last secured a high-speed telegrapher. We arranged that I was to describe the fight from the ringside blow by blow. My telegrapher was to take it down on the typewriter and give it to Smith to repeat into the radio transmitter at Hoboken. Our operators throughout the country would then receive from the Hoboken station and give the account to the crowds through the loudspeakers. At the last minute, in a very pessimistic frame of mind, I decided to put a gong in our Hoboken station. At least the gong will be audible and the operators will know when a round ends and another begins, I thought. I was placed next to the press box, right at the ringside. Putting up my equipment, I proceeded to describe the preliminary bouts and the big fight round by round. It was a boiling hot day, the hottest day in history, I think, and I was right out in the glare, with the sun beating mercilessly on me for more than 4 hours. My throat was hot and dusty, my voice was tired, but I talked on and on, giving minute details of each blow. I had no time to ask my Hoboken station whether they were getting the fight clearly. I simply droned on and on, trusting to luck that the transmission was distinct. At length came Carpentier's knockout. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. With a terrific bang, the 400 telegraph operators at the ringside flashed the news to their home papers. Simultaneously, every sports writer at the field frantically phoned his office the news that Dempsey retained his title. Our current was nearly used up. I calmly described the knockout and then remarked, "Dempsey is still champion of the world." Tired but satisfied with my afternoon's work, I tried to communicate with my Hoboken station to get a checkup on the audibility of the transmission. The line was dead. There I was. For 4 hours, I had talked steadily under that hot sun, in the fight arena dust, giving the best that was in me. And now when I tried to find out the results of my work, the line was dead. I had visions of having spent the afternoon in vain, of having worked night and day from April to July and then having my whole foolhardy plan come to nothing, of having to face my cynical friends with their I told you so's, of having to admit that I was licked, and of having to break the unpleasant news to the radio corporation that Mr. Sarnoff had lost his gamble. Utterly discouraged, I tried once more. After several minutes' wait, and it seemed hours, an answer finally came back from the Hoboken station. "What," I demanded breathlessly, "was the last thing you heard?" Thoroughly casual, the telegraph operator replied, "Dempsey is still champion of the world." My whole afternoon's description had been heard. I had won the gamble. Then came a stream of telegrams and more than 4,000 letters. The receiving operators were wildly enthusiastic. They had heard everything. Functioning indifferently well, the loudspeakers had brought the blow-by-blow account clearly to the auditoriums. The crowds who heard the radio descriptions knew the outcome sooner than those who had depended on any other means of communication. The first time radio had been used for news, it had justified itself. Several days later, I met Tex Rickard, who had promoted the fight. "I've been wanting to see you," Tex began. "I understand your description of the fight was the sensation of the afternoon. They tell me even the gong was audible." Considering that the gong had been right in the Hoboken station, I was much amused that he should have commented on it. Major White is always experimenting with something new. He is an explorer at heart. He loves adventure. He likes the thick of the fight. A picturesque figure he is, who, even in this mundane, placid world, manages to inject thrills and hairbreadth escapes. Tricks Used in Staging Invisible Shows by C.H. Huntley, General Electric Company. Radio broadcast, November 1923. The radio audience is, in effect, an audience of the blind. It is evident that if plays are to be presented by radio, the producer must keep constantly in mind that the appeal to the imagination can be made only through the sense of hearing. Merely putting it in touch with the stage of a theater, therefore, is not enough. Until about a year ago, such attempts as had been made to broadcast plays were not particularly successful. Individual scenes from plays had been given occasionally, and The Perfect Fool and Lightning had been put on the air from the theater in Chicago where they were presented. That is to say, microphones were placed on or near the stage, and the performances were heard just as given. But the interludes were tiresome to the radio listeners, and the stage business, visible to those in the theater, was utterly lost on those who followed the play by radio. Edward H. Smith, an actor of professional experience, conceived the idea of adapting a play to meet the specific needs of play broadcasting, and to solve the problems it presented. He suggested this to Colin Hager, studio director of WGY, the General Electric Company's station at Schenectady. The idea appealed to Mr. Hager, who stipulated, however, that the play must not take more than 40 minutes, as it was to be only one of several features of the program, and the interest of the radio public in such an effort was problematical. The play chosen was The Wolf by Eugene Walter. In cutting down the 3-act drama to a play of 40 minutes, the second act was taken as the basis, with parts of the first and third acts blended in. A special finale was written. Mr. Walter had insisted that the play be given with a complete cast, and the actors who had had actual stage experience were selected for it. Viola Karwowska played the part of Hilda. Frank Finch was Jules Beaubien. James S.B. Mularkey was Andrew McTavish. Henry Miller was Huntley, and Mr. Smith doubled as MacDonald and Baptiste Legrand. 3 of these actors had previously appeared in the stage presentation of this play. After several careful rehearsals conducted as though on a real stage, the play was given. Then came the response, in the form of 2,000 letters from appreciative listeners scattered throughout a territory within 500 miles of WGY, expressing their thanks and approval. The section covered would doubtless have been greater had the play been given later in the season, when the static was not such a handicap. Nevertheless, the screams of Hilda were so realistic in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, as they issued from a loudspeaker there, that a policeman patrolling his beat hastened to the house from which the sounds came, to find out who was being battered and assaulted. This first presentation gave the actors some valuable experience. It taught them that the greater the volume of sound, the farther back from the microphone they had to be. As the play neared the end, the din increased to such an extent that the operators of the station tried to soften it by decreasing the amount of power used. The result was that the close of the play was almost inaudible to some listeners. From then on, as an actor raised his voice, he retired farther and farther from the microphone. So pronounced was the success of this first presentation that it was decided to make plays a regular feature of the WGY program, and to retain the group of actors who had given the initial performance. It was still considered necessary, however, to have plays brought within a 40-minute compass, made up of 4 episodes of 10 minutes each. This time limit imposed considerable difficulty in some cases. For example, it took 6 weeks to reduce The Garden of Allah, which consists of 10 scenes and takes 2 hours for presentation on the stage, to the required length. After 8 plays had been given, the popularity of drama by radio was plainly so great that the time limit was removed. Beginning with The Garden of Allah, the presentation of a play became a part of the WGY program each week, and the WGY players became a definite organization. In all, 43 plays, both dramas and comedies, had been given up to the close of June, when the regular players gave way, through the summer, to understudies. They have resumed their work this fall. As showing the appeal this form of entertainment has made to the public, it is interesting to note that The Sign of the Cross, Wilson Barrett's well-known play, which was given by the WGY players during Christmas week, brought 1,500 letters in one day, while the total number received in 4 days was approximately 6,000. Late in July, letters of commendation on the presentation of The Green Goddess, which was presented on March 8th, and which in some ways was the most successful of the plays given, were still being received. The average theatergoer has at least some conception of the backstage apparatus used to help produce illusions. The devices for simulating thunder, the roar of an approaching train, the sound of horses' hooves, and so on. Probably few of the listeners to drama by radio have given much thought as to how the same effects are produced in broadcasting, where they are relatively much more essential, because the success of the presentation depends on the appeal to the ear alone. How important the visual factor in dramatic entertainment is clear from the popularity of the movies. What seem like odd expedients have become commonplace to the WGY players. One of the most difficult propositions of this kind was met in preparing for the broadcasting of The Storm. In this play, a forest fire culminates in the crashing of a burning log through the roof of a cabin. To provide the roar of the conflagration, it was at first planned to build a fire in the rear of the building containing the studio, and bring microphones sufficiently near to catch the sound. But on experimenting, it was found unsatisfactory. Gasoline torches were therefore temporarily installed in an adjoining room, and provided a very efficient substitute. The crackling of ignited twigs was simulated by crumpling brittle paper in front of the microphone. And to produce the sound of falling limbs, a heavy table was thumped on the studio floor. The final scene, with the collapse of the roof under the impact of the falling log, was made real to the audience by the simple expedient of having one of the actors jump from a table onto a packing case, and crashing in the top. It required 4 men to work these various effects. The result was that, while not a word had been spoken to indicate what was happening, the illusion of a forest fire was perfect. A man in Nevada wrote that when the tree crashed through the roof, he ducked. Holding a folded newspaper against the edge of a moving electric fan makes a well-nigh perfect imitation of the droning whir of an airplane. The rattle of dishes and silver at once conveys the idea of dining. The clink of coins suggests the giving of a tip, and an empty bottle in a pitcher of water at once conjures up visions of ice water. And at the risk of killing the romance for some who have been thrilled by radio dramas, it may be admitted that in the love scenes, the hero plants a kiss not on the lips of the heroine, but on the back of his own hand. Indeed, the hero and the fair lady are often at opposite ends of the room. Infinite attention is given this matter of sound. If one of the actors is supposed to be talking while eating, he actually eats a sandwich. Wireless telegraph messages are real messages, sent by a bona fide operator by use of a spark set installed for the purpose. The clicking of a telegraph which the audience hears is that of a real sounder operated in the studio. Regulation thundermaking and other devices familiar to the stage are employed, and entrances and exits are marked by the banging of doors. The members of the cast do not, of course, appear in costume. They read their parts from manuscript, which is typewritten on paper especially selected for its freedom from crackling sound when the leaves are turned, and each actor is furnished with a complete copy. Reading the parts instead of committing them to memory obviates any danger of forgetting, and makes the presentation smoother than it could possibly be otherwise. Each play is, however, very carefully rehearsed before it is given. In the case of Madam X, there were 4 general rehearsals and numerous others for individual players as well. The care that is exercised is evident from the fact that, during rehearsals, the player's director, Mr. Smith, is in another room from the rest of the cast when he is not acting a role, and hears the play through a receiving set just as it would sound to the great audience. He issues his directions through a loudspeaker. 2 microphones are used in transmission, one for men and one for women, this being necessitated by the difference in the quality of their voices. Voice quality is of the utmost importance in this work. According to Mr. Smith, the ideal voice for the purpose is of low rather than high pitch. The enunciation must be very clear and naturally clear, as any stilted attempt at precision tends to spoil the effect. The value of pause is something that must be learned. The careful actor in this work shades the pauses to almost a fraction of a second. The volume is usually confined to that of an ordinary conversation. If the scene calls for more, the actor steps back from the microphone. Nervousness, of course, tends to raise the pitch of the voice, but nervousness is not a factor among the WGY players. Stage fright, even among the amateurs who sometimes take minor parts to complete a cast, has not been noticeable. The whole atmosphere of the studio when a play is being given is one of congeniality, and a performance takes on, so far as the actors are concerned, something of the nature of a rehearsal, inasmuch as no audience is visible. The realization that thousands are listening does, however, spur the players to their best efforts. That illusion and atmosphere may be created by sound alone, the presentation of plays by radio has definitely established. In a letter received at the studio following the presentation of The Green Goddess, a listener wrote, "I want to add my appreciation of The Green Goddess broadcasted last week. It was superb. Maybe I enjoyed it more because I am familiar with the hill station region of the Himalayas. You got the local color splendidly. The palace and social life of the Raja were very vivid. The English resident was perfect, as were also the major and his wife. The doctor was just the kind that appeals to all of us. The radio drama has an advantage over the movie drama in that it is carried right into the home, whether it be an isolated farmhouse or a city apartment. Thus, it is available to those who are unable to go out for their entertainment. It creates a stage in every home equipped with receiving apparatus. Judging from the favor with which it has been received and the progress it has made in a single year, the radio drama will rapidly develop into a recognized branch of the dramatic art. The Continuity Program. Radio broadcast, August 1927. WEAF Network. The Coca-Cola Girl. The opening program of a new series. Advance notices prepared us to expect great things of this new weekly serial. It would, we were told, combine drama and music in a manner never before used in radio. At last, we told ourselves, we are to hear the ideal continuity program. So much for our expectations. We are still looking for the perfect continuity hour. The soft drink damsels program is not it. The saddest part of it is that it could have been. The general idea of the new feature is not bad at all. In fact, it's very good, but its execution is terrible. Each broadcast in the series is to present an episode in the life of one Vivian, a beautiful young Southern girl. The first one saw her at her coming out party, an occasion which brought back to her hometown her friend of childhood days, Dick Amberson, accompanied by his friend James. Jim promptly fell in love with her, and, it is to be presumed, will pursue her through the remaining episodes. During their conversations, snatches of music are introduced illustrative of what they are saying, so you see, the idea had marvelous possibilities. But neither the actors nor their lines are good, though acting and lines would seem to be two important elements in drama. The lines are amateurishly written and horribly stiff. Jim, being presumably an average American youth, would probably have said, upon viewing Vivian, "Pretty swell-looking bimbo," or something equally inelegant. Instead, he is made to say, "I suppose everyone that lays eyes upon her is captivated by her." And on one occasion, he is made to ejaculate, "Capital!" To the actor's credit, whenever he has a line that isn't too infernally impossible, he puts quite a bit of conviction into it. But the Vivian, aside from the handicap of poor lines, is ill-suited for the part. She may look young and beautiful and southern, but all we have to go by is her voice, which, though not displeasing, is certainly not young or southern. It is decidedly matronly and decidedly eclectic in its accent. We dwell thus long on a feature which certainly doesn't deserve the space simply because of the great possibilities which it has left unrealized, and because it paves the way for some other advertiser to take up the same idea and handle it properly. How is it to be done properly? Well, it would take a considerable outlay of funds. In the first place, it would take an expert to compose the lines. It seems to us that the best writer available would be none too good. To suggest a couple of names, either Mary Roberts Reinhardt or Booth Tarkington could do the job handily. Either one could, without much effort, compose a series of 13 episodes that would be not only true to life and entertaining, but which would provide an interesting commentary on the contemporary younger generation. Next, a couple of talented, well-seasoned actors would be necessary to acquit the lines convincingly. The program here reviewed lacked what is known to the stage as click. That is, the speakers didn't follow, overlap, or interrupt each other in a way characteristic of natural conversation. It can be done, and the proof of it is Sam and Henry. Whether you like these two WGN entertainers or not, you must admit they deliver their stuff in a most expert and realistic manner. These actors would not have to be the same ones who furnished the singing bits, as it is an easy matter for radio to double a singer without anyone knowing the difference. As to the interwoven theme of music, we think in this phase of the program at least, the Coca-Cola girl did itself proud, and any subsequent imitation of this program could study its method of handling the score to advantage. We offer these suggestions for an ideal continuity program to whomsoever will take them. To engage the services of a bestseller author would, we grant, cost a lot of money, but we think it would be repaid in the prestige it lent the program. Moreover, it would intrigue many thousands of the more sophisticated radio set owners into listening, without in any way diminishing the pleasure of the lowbrow listeners who gobble up anything like this, good or bad. Radiophone in New York hotels. Radio News, June 1922. Calling Mr. James Smith, shouts the hotel bellhop. Here you are, boy. I'm Mr. James Smith. Who wants me? Mr. Jones on the America wants to speak to you on the radiophone, sir. He's 300 miles out to sea. Just take the nearest telephone booth. Thank you, sir. Mr. Smith went to the telephone booth and spoke to Mr. Jones on the America. From the booth, he held a long conversation with his friend, who was comfortably reclining on a settee in the stateroom on board the SS America, miles out to sea. A little later on, Mr. Smith went to his bedroom on the 12th floor of the hotel, and being rather bored and in need of entertainment, he glanced through the program in the newspaper of the local broadcasting station. He found a selection that he fancied would please him, and lifting the telephone receiver, he spoke to the telephone operator. Will you give me a call at 8:30 and let me hear Miss Ather when she sings the Rosary? No, this is not a fanciful dream. We are not conjecturing up possibilities for the year 1923. It is actually happening or about to happen here and now in several New York hotels, and it is only beginning. Mr. Augustus Knoll of the Waldorf Astoria and the McAlpin, in cooperation with Mr. H.R. Martin, telephone manager, was the first to inaugurate this service. It has been taken up by Sherry's and the Claridge, and others are following in line. There will soon be no hotel complete without it. The people demand it, and in conformity with the slogan of the New York hotel service, what the people want, they must get if it is possible to give it to them. Mr. Knoll and Mr. Martin have demonstrated it to be not only possible, but easily accomplished. The Peacock Alley of the Waldorf has long had its attractions, but they must look to their laurels since the loudspeaker has appeared in all its familiar and engaging ugliness to charm the listeners of the famous runway with its mysterious music. Mr. Martin, in an interview, demonstrated his apparatus in the telephone exchange room of the McAlpin, which was located after burrowing through many strange and hitherto unknown passages on the top floor of the building. An antenna on the roof connects to a honeycomb coil receiver with detector and two-step amplifier. The output was connected through the monitor and the main switchboard to any room or booth in the hotel, or, we suspect, panhandled to the outside. Mr. Martin stated that he expects soon to have a transmitting set in operation in order that two-way conversation with ships at sea may be maintained. The other hotels will undoubtedly follow the example of the McAlpin in this regard. For, incidentally, is it not the quickest, surest, and most novel way of providing passengers on incoming steamships with a method of securing accommodations at the hotel? Hotels have long had an arrangement with the radio companies to allow passengers to send radiograms free of charge to the hotel. But imagine the stampede at the radio room of the Olympic when it is announced to incoming passengers that they can speak direct to their hotel in New York. When DeWolf Hopper broadcasted to his biggest audience. Radio broadcast, August 1922. 6 people had to do all the audible laughing for an audience optimistically estimated at 300,000 when DeWolf Hopper broadcasted his famous voice from WJZ in Newark, New Jersey recently. But the laughter proved a boon to the great comedian because he could judge by its duration just when the points of his jokes had sunk in, and it was time for him to resume his monologue. "It was a peculiar and dramatic sensation," he said, "speaking to thousands upon thousands of people you couldn't see. I couldn't realize that so many people were hearing me. My performance lasted about 20 minutes, 5.5 of which I devoted to reciting Casey at the Bat. That was the hardest thing of all because I couldn't gesticulate. I had to keep my mouth about 6 inches from the little drum suspended in front of me." Mr. Hopper's mobile voice sank to a sorrowful note as he spoke of the difficulty of delivering this famous baseball recitation without the emphatic gesticulations which have delighted his audiences for more than a quarter of a century. His fists involuntarily clenched themselves. "I couldn't do this," he said mournfully, "when I came to the line, 'Strike out.' It was a peculiar thing, however, that I think I never recited Casey better. There I was in that long, narrow room, with no way to tell whether I was pleasing my audience or not. There were only 6 people in the room, a gentleman and lady who had accompanied me, my son, the soloist who was to follow me, and 2 operators. But they all laughed a lot, and that helped me to judge how long to pause to achieve my effects. I would wait until they stopped laughing, and then begin to talk again. I told jokes and talked about some party and greeted some old friends, who had told me they would be listening in, but of course I couldn't tell how they liked it. In the days after my initial performance, however, I got millions of letters. I remember one in particular which appealed to me. It was from 2 baseball fans telling me how much they appreciated Casey. They wrote that they had been baseball fans all their lives, and that one of them was 82 and the other one was 84. It was a strange experience at first, he concluded, but of course I'm used to it now. British listeners want lighter broadcast fare. Radio broadcast, July 1927. The business of operating a broadcasting monopoly, it would seem to us from our occasional reading of English periodicals, is no more of a sinecure than the operating of a competitive station in America. Complaints are continually visible in the British press concerning the manner in which the BBC presents its programs. Most of the complaints seem to be to the effect that the BBC is too highbrow and is taking advantage of its monopolistic position to high-hat the common people. The London Daily Mail conducted a ballot of the preferences of the listening public, and received the astonishing number of 1,285,083 replies. A vote of this size, it seems to us, can be taken as a very adequate expression of the general opinion in Great Britain, and this is how it resulted. The tenor of the vote was, as can be seen, 1. A vote for more fun. 2. A vote for fewer features which need sustained attention. The British conclusions rather parallel those gained from the questionnaire run in this department. Our readers have an overwhelming preference for instrumental music, and a comparative indifference to plays, scientific talks, readings, and so forth. If a comparison to our questionnaire, which resulted in only 100th as many replies, were fair, we might argue that the American public has a more sophisticated taste in music, since serious music, as of symphony orchestras, topped the list in our readers' vote, but is relegated to 6th place in the British vote. America, fascinated by airphones, passes her first radio Christmas. New science which now grips the entire nation was being recognized as a popular hobby just 1 year ago this season. Radio Digest, December 30th, 1922. We are again at the end of another year. Father Time steps aside for the new urchin that makes his way to us. The year just passing has been a busy one for the radio engineers. Just a year ago, the new science was just beginning to be recognized as a popular pastime. It has been an unusual year. It was not necessary to popularize radio. The people of the nation just had to fall in line to keep up with it. Now, as a fitting climax for the last week in the year, everybody has taken up "This is a Radio Christmas" with fervor, and all have lent a hand to make it the best. There are many thousands who have listened in on the best broadcasts of the year this week, who never gave the science a single thought 1 year ago. But things have traveled fast for most of us, and many are tinkering with the set who would have poo-pooed at the idea months ago. The special Christmas programs given at the different stations have been such that each has tried to outdo the other in quality and in distance work. The new fan is just as proud to have heard a distant station as a boy with a new toy. Many of the radio dealers who put in apparatus just as a sideline found that the sideline outclassed any other one in their store. In fact, some of them have discontinued all other goods and have turned their entire attention to radio sales and their development. We have only reached the dawn of a new era, and the best of us cannot fathom its future. If we hear of a new circuit, the public goes wild over it. If it works well, then its popularity spreads faster than any new invention ever brought out through the patent office. At this time, no one person can set forth a plan of how to go about making the science any more popular than it is today. While this was a radio Christmas, the very first one of its kind, there seems to be no question but what there will be many of them in the years to come. What the next one will be, nobody can prophesy. Estimates have been made as to the numbers of radio enthusiasts. There is no need to make estimates. The numbers are not right. There is no way of getting the exact count, even within many hundreds of thousands. Without a doubt, there is not one intelligent person in the nation but what has listened in on broadcasts. You may never have owned a set, but it is so fascinating that you cannot help but get an ear close to one if it is possible for you to do so. We cannot say more for its popularity at this, the first Radio Christmas. Motion Pictures and the Radio by Olga Prinsloo. The Truth About the Movies by the Stars. Motion pictures and the radio must coordinate. It is logical that they should, for the one is sight unheard and the other sound unseen. Each is an art in itself, and yet, like all of the great arts, one can help the other. There was a time when the belief among the studios was that radio would injure motion pictures, but this time is past. They are now working together for the greatest good, as is proven by the fact that most of the great artists are lending their talents to broadcasting. The value of radio to the motion picture industry is easily understandable if one knows the numerous fields reached by the broadcasting stations. One of the best-known directors in Hollywood said, "While ability is absolutely necessary in the cast of a picture, it is publicity which puts the picture over." Proof of this is seen in the enormous amount of money spent in familiarizing the public with the picture both before and after it is released. Now stop to think that each evening when the broadcasting stations in this country go on the air, every word spoken is heard by more than 25 million persons, and this number of listeners in is growing by leaps and bounds. What would it cost in dollars and time to get the name of a picture or an artist to this many people by any other means than radio? You may answer the above by saying, that may be true for the producer or the artist, but how about the exhibitor? Does he not lose out through the public staying away from the picture house to listen to the radios? The answer is, not if the motion picture industry will cooperate with radio, for the public will be all the more anxious to see the picture of the artist whose voice they have heard over the air. To prove that the statement in the last paragraph is not mere supposition or theory, let us quote a specific instance. Just 1 year ago, the Los Angeles Times broadcasting station, known as Radio KHJ, put on a program known as the Sandman's Hour. This 45-minute program has been broadcast from this station every Tuesday evening since that time, and the theme of the Sandman's Hour revolves around little Queen Titania of Fairyland, who comes to Earth for this period to talk to mortals. Such interest was aroused through the program broadcasted by this 6-year-old that she has become known all over the country as the mystery child of radio. Letters are constantly pouring in, expressing the enjoyment which Queen Titania is bringing to the world. Over 10,000 letters are now on file, with each day bringing more and more. These letters are from all over the world, such places as Hawaii, Philippines, Samoa, New Zealand, Australia, and in fact, practically every civilized country has been heard from. Not long ago, Ivan Khan completed a picture entitled Saturday. The company making this picture had a cast composed entirely of children, headed by Radioland's beloved Queen Titania. This picture was previewed at one of the Hollywood theaters. Did the public say, "We will not go see the picture, we will stay home and listen to the radio"? They did not. 1 hour before the doors opened, the street in front of the Playhouse was jammed with people. When the house had been filled to capacity for the first show, there were enough people still in line to fill it again, and they waited. After the second capacity house had been filled, there were still about 600 people who were turned away, and the management asked if they might run the picture again the following day. This is just one instance of why motion pictures and radio should cooperate. If more proof is required, just ask Monty Blue why he is the guest announcer at one of the Los Angeles broadcasting stations, very frequently. Find Missing Youth by WWJ Broadcast. Toledo Scoutmaster gets description listening in on Detroit News concert and locates boy. Radio Digest Illustrated. April 15th, 1922. Detroit, Michigan. The Detroit News radio station, WWJ, interrupted its concert long enough to give a description of a missing youth. The next evening after giving out the description, the boy was on his way home in charge of his brother. His speedy return was due to the fact that a Toledo Scoutmaster was able to put 2 and 2 together and get results. Scoutmaster F.J.J. Lehman was listening to a concert at his son's radio station. The concert was interrupted to make a request that all members of the news radio family assist a Detroit mother in locating her missing boy, Alvin Pruitt. His description followed. In a Saturday's paper, Dr. Lehman read an article about a boy at the juvenile home who claimed to be named Stevens and have his home with his aunt in Missouri. The aunt sent word that no boy by the name of Stevens was missing, but that her nephew Purvitt had not been seen for some time. The similarity of names caused Dr. Lehman to call up the matron at the home, and the description of the boy there tallied exactly with that of the missing Detroit lad. Monday, Pruitt's brother took him back to Detroit. This is believed to be the first time radio has ever been used to locate missing persons. Have you heard these stations yet? CKAC in Montreal, WGR in Buffalo, New York, and WGY in Schenectady, New York are broadcasting excellent musical programs. Their wavelengths are 430, 400, and 400 meters respectively. Radio broadcast, May 1923. Up in Montreal, Canada, there is a French newspaper called La Presse, which has installed a broadcasting station that is unusual in several respects. One man, Mr. J.N. Carter, performs alone the various duties of announcer, manager, and operator. This he is able to do by reason of the special type of broadcasting equipment which, although the station is a powerful one, is simple in operation. No motor generators are used, the alternating current supply from the city being passed through two giant rectifier tubes to supply the required voltages. CKAC has a splendid pipe organ of its own installed in the studio. The illustration shows an organist giving a recital to an audience which undoubtedly contained as many Americans as Canadians. The language of music is of course universal, but the announcements at CKAC are made in both French and English, and the programs also are given sometimes in one tongue, sometimes in the other. To tune in this Montreal station, you must go up to 430 meters. The Federal Telephone and Telegraph Company has a station in Buffalo, New York, known to a large radio audience as WGR. Possibly you have heard of it. It has been performing a useful service in transmitting weather and market reports as well as all manner of musical and other entertainment, and is planning to extend its scope to include educational courses of various kinds. The broadcast division of the federal company expects also to make WGR a public forum for the discussion of matters of national and local interest. As will be seen from the picture, an elaborate system of hangings and floor coverings has been worked out which isolates the studio from all sounds but those desired for broadcasting. A third station, which is gaining a wide reputation for its musical programs, is WGY, the station of the General Electric Company at Schenectady, New York. It has a powerful transmitting installation and has been heard in every state in the Union and in several foreign countries. The orchestra, which is shown in the picture, has won the enthusiastic praise of listeners in from far and near. These 5 players also supply the music for the light operas, such as Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance, broadcasted from WGY from time to time. Volstead in the Air. Radio broadcast, July 1923. In trying out the radio public to see what they like and what they don't like, WEAF, the well-known station of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company in New York, recently staged a debate on the liquor question. Resolved that the Volstead Act should be repealed. This station is continually experimenting with broadcast material, not only with the idea of giving the public varied entertainment, but of enabling those responsible for its operation to gauge the extent of the public's interest in radio, and to endeavor to gather reliable statistics as to what kind of programs the public wants. It is evidently in this way only that proper development of radio entertainment can be brought about. Only by the tone of the correspondence received can the manager of the station judge of his success in catering to the public's desires. The American Telephone and Telegraph Company is spending many thousands of dollars a year to get the correct answer to the question, what is the demand for broadcasting? The debate on the value of Mr. Volstead's activities was brought about by the Government Club. The president of this organization, Mrs. George E. Owens, having charge of the program, introducing the speakers, and reading the questions sent in by the radio listeners. The public had been told to send in questions as the debate progressed, and that their questions would be answered as far as possible by the debaters. The debaters were Wayne B. Wheeler, General Counsel of the Anti-Saloon League of America, and Ransom H. Gillett, General Counsel of the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment. That the question was a live one in which the listeners took an intense interest soon became evident as the questions poured in. Only a small fraction of them could be answered in the time allotted. As we listened to this debate and pictured the invisible audience of possibly hundreds of thousands, the great utility of radio for political campaigning was once more driven home. The questions asked by the listeners showed thought, showed that the debaters were being closely followed in their arguments by their vast audience. When used by persons aspiring to governmental positions, this method of presenting their virtues will prove of real value to those of worth, and should show up at the same time the hollow arguments and fallacies of the familiar political spellbinder. Not only is this scheme of contact between orator and public valuable to the public, allowing them to analyze what the speaker is trying to put over, but it also has certain advantages for the speaker. It makes him condense his arguments to such a degree that he cannot well remain ignorant of the weak spots and possible fallacies in his speech, and it furthermore allows him to proceed uninterrupted to the end. His would-be hecklers must remain silent until he chooses to answer their questions. Broadcasting First Presidential Message to Congress by S.R. Winters. Radio News, February 1923. When President Warren G. Harding delivered his message to a joint assembly of the House of Representatives and Senate on December 8th, for the first time in the history of the sessions of the American Congress, the utterances of a President of the United States were heard by an invisible audience by means of the radio telephone. His pungent remarks, "There are conditions relating to its 18th constitutional amendment enforcement which savor of a nationwide scandal, and agricultural ill fortune is a national ill fortune," were heard with a distinctness within a radius of approximately 200 miles of the national capital, as did the members of the cabinet who occupied front seats in the House of Representatives. The radical departure of broadcasting the deliverance of a president is epochal, and radio telephony demonstrated certain advantages over Morse telegraphy and bell telephony as a means of communication. The vastness of the area covered within the twinkling of an eye is a peculiar virtue of this vehicle of intelligence. The voice of President Harding on the State of the Union as he specifically addressed the fourth session of the 67th Congress was probably heard by the largest audience in the history of the world. The seating capacity of the House of Representatives was occupied to the point of overflowing, thus constituting his visible hearers. The invisible audience, it would be hazardous to attempt to name its numbers, was comprised of the thousands of owners of radio telephone receiving outfits who were apprised of the deliverance of the message, and those who had the inclination to listen in. A microphone mounted on a pedestal, located about 4 feet from the rostrum on which President Harding stood, received the voice vibrations. From this cup-like device, the sound waves were conveyed by a telephone wire to the Naval Air Station at Anacostia, D.C., approximately 4 miles away. Here, the United States Navy Department maintains a powerful radio telephone transmitting outfit, the one in service at Schenectady, New York, under the direction of the General Electric Company, alone exceeding its range as a radio telephone sending station. The message of the chief executive of the nation, having been relayed to Anacostia along a telephone line built by the Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company, was broadcast on 427 meters. The daylight effective range of the radio telephone transmitter at the Anacostia Naval Air Station is approximately 200 miles, compared to a radius of 750 to 1,000 miles at night. The utterances of the president borne on the medium of electromagnetic waves transmitted from Anacostia were received by newspapers and other radio telephone stations in the east, west, south, and north, and rebroadcasted to another invisible audience. The Pittsburgh Post, Chicago News, Indianapolis News, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Kansas City Star, and Denver Post covered the western half of the country as with a blanket. Northward, wireless stations in Philadelphia, Newark, and the American Telegraph and Telephone Company, New York, disseminated the words of President Harding. In the South, the Louisville Courier-Journal and Times and other newspapers maintaining wireless receiving and sending apparatus picked up the message on 427 meters from the Naval Air Station and rebroadcast it to thousands of radio telephone receiving sets in resonance with the transmitters. The dignified Secretary of State, Charles E. Hughes, who occupied a front seat in the House of Representatives, was in common with the rural dweller in the isolated farmstead, or the boy in the red schoolhouse on the hill, in hearing the voice of the chief executive of the nation, if the latter perchanced to own a wireless receiving outfit. Fortunately, Mrs. Harding was not denied the privilege of hearing the voice of her distinguished husband on this occasion, since a radio telephone receiving apparatus was available in the White House, where she has been convalescing from a serious illness for several months. Until her illness, the First Lady of the land had accompanied President Harding to the Capitol on every occasion that he addressed a joint sitting of Congress. Unable to attend this time, the wonderful wireless waves, in part at least, counteracted the disappointment of forced detention in the White House. The mechanism for relaying the voice of the president to Anacostia was installed by the Western Electric Company, and the local telephone company projected a telephone wire from the Capitol to this point. To the microphone was attached 3 telephone circuits, with direct connections to the Anacostia Naval Air Station. Only one of these electric circuits was employed in conveying the message of the president. The second circuit was used as a so-called order wire, thus affording means for telephone engineers to conduct conversations while observing the action of the voice of the president as it was relayed for a distance of about 4 miles. This observance contemplated the maintenance of an evenness of tone as the voice was impinged on the microphone, and then conveyed by wire to Anacostia. The third circuit in the series was an emergency unit, which would have avoided a complete disruption of the service in the event of a breakdown of the other 2 telephone lines. The system, for the most part, duplicated that in operation when the addresses of the speakers at the dedication exercises of the Lincoln Memorial were relayed to Anacostia and Arlington, from which points they were broadcasted by radio telephone. Also, a similar service was maintained at the ceremonies incident to the burial of the unknown soldier in Arlington Cemetery. The radio telephone installation made in the House of Representatives for the dissemination of the message of President Harding is of a permanent character. This fact, however, does not give assurance that the proceedings of Congress will be broadcasted by radio telephony or wireless telegraphy. The doings of Congress may eventually be radiated throughout the United States, but such action is not a certainty at this time. Such a service contemplates the use of a high-power radio-telephone transmitting station, the operation of which, of course, involves the expenditure of money. The wireless telephone and telegraph transmitting stations of the United States Navy Department are dedicated to other services, the dispatch of naval business and the broadcasting of serviceable communications from allied government departments. On this occasion, permit to use the radio-telephone transmitter at the Anacostia Naval Air Station was granted by Commander S.C. Hooper, head of the Radio Division, Bureau of Engineering, United States Navy Department. Somebody, however, ventures the prediction that Congress will eventually authorize an appropriation and construct its own high-power transmitting station, whereby the proceedings of the House of Representatives and Senate may be instantly and widely disseminated. This prophecy, sponsored by a radio engineer of a government department, is partially based on the anticipated favorable reaction of the precedent established in blanketing the deliverance of Warren G. Harding over the continent by means of the radio telephone. Children hear monks and dogs on the air. Radio Digest, January 16, 1926. With motion pictures, zoos in the city parks, and practical facts about natural history in the schools, children are becoming almost too sophisticated for such stories as The Three Bears and Peter Rabbit. Purely imaginary, says Willie with a yawn when Mother starts the pretty little tale of Goldilocks. I grant you that bears growl and they live in the woods. They might even take up an abode in an abandoned hunter's cabin, furnished in a meager way with chairs and beds. But when it comes to cooking and passing remarks such as, "Who's been sitting in my chair?" and all that rot, I simply cannot believe it. In the first place, bears lack the vocal equipment to articulate words devised by the genus Homo. It's absurd, I might almost add presumptuous, for a presumably intelligent parent to even attempt to foist such nonsense onto the credulity of a trusting child. Something should be done about it. These childish illusions which have endured for generations must be preserved by some means or other. Perhaps radio will solve the problem. As a suggestion, would it not be a sure way to interest Willie if he could actually hear real honest-to-goodness bears growling while the good story lady tells the tale? Steps in this direction have already been taken. At Universal City, California, they have a zoo where the jungle chatter is especially animated. The least little incident starts off a veritable cascade of animal palaver that winds up with every beast trying to make himself heard at the same time. Whoever started the rumor that animals are dumb should pay a visit here. You take Jiggs, always in trouble with his family or some other monk's family. If Maggie happens to be busy with the little Jiggses at one side of the cage, Jiggs, likely as not, may be chinning with Mrs. Jocko, widow of that old coconut milk soak who passed out 3 months ago. Well, the Bam Bam monks in the next cage tune in, get excited, and jabber their opinions to every other creature within hearing, until the tale, greatly exaggerated, reaches Leo, the lion. Then the whole zoo is in an uproar, and over nothing at all. Carl Lemley, paterfamilias to the Universal Institution in general, got the idea the children would like to listen in on some of this jungle powwow, so we had a microphone brought up for the animals to make their radio debut. Jiggs started it off and Leo ended it. The children pronounced it a great success. It was over a year ago that the golden notes of the English nightingale were wafted into a concealed microphone and broadcast to radio listeners throughout the British Isles, and even so far as the continent. A pair of the nightingales had taken up their residence in a small arbor in the garden of Colonel and Mrs. Harrison's estate near London. Cables were laid through the vines and a microphone ambushed among the leaves. Miss Beatrice Harrison, having previously discovered that the birds found inspiration in her cello, carried the instrument out to a convenient place and began to play. Seemingly flattered by such an unusual accompaniment, the nightingales fluttered near and took up the song, their tiny throats fairly bursting with throbbing melody. Off through the cables and the tubes and the antenna, their voices were instantly radiated for 1,000 or more miles roundabout, bringing intense joy to children and their elders in the more crowded districts of the city, where nightingales are unknown. We are enraptured with the songs of the birds, but few persons would care to compliment the sea lions for their vocal accomplishments. Imagine a sea lion duet. They are like some radio sets. Plenty of volume, but low-grade quality. However, in the New York Zoological Park, a microphone was placed at the edge of the pool where the sea lions live. To a sea lion, volume is the essence of quality in itself, and the sea lion that can croak and bark the loudest gets the prima donna role. So the prima donna and the runner-up put on a duet that almost knocked everything but the crystal sets out of business for miles around. Dogs on numerous occasions have had their turn at broadcasting. One of the most intelligent dog radio artists naturally lives in Boston. His name is Pep, and the hundreds of thousands of children who spend the story hour with Big Brother Bob Emery are acquainted with Pep's cheerful ejaculations at appropriate times. Pep is the original big radio dog. He enjoys the WEEI story hour as much as anybody, and seems to fully comprehend what is expected of him. When he addresses the microphone, he puts his paws on Brother Bob's shoulders, and his jaws come about level with the aperture. If he were to stand up straight on his hind legs, Big Brother Bob would come about to Pep's collar buckle. Maud, Julie, and Trixie, 3 music-loving young elephants at Luna Park, New York, prefer to do their broadcasting in the old-fashioned way, without the aid of radio transmission. But when it comes to listening in, just hand them a good superhet and they will tickle the dials with the sensitive tips of their trunks until they get what they want through the loudspeaker. Then they will sit back on some old tubs and listen with the keenest pleasure. They are particularly fond of band music and sway their bodies when the rhythm isn't too fast. Some smart uncle or aunt or big brother will get the animals together one of these days and put on a regular air circus. Peter Rabbit may be lost in the broadcast shuffle, but the 3 bears ought to be able to do their stuff with a little assistance. And then happy days will come for our over-sophisticated youngsters. Boom times in radio. Radio News, March 1922. The situation in radio for which every ardent well-wisher of the art has been longing seems to have arrived at last. Due to the activities of the various broadcasting stations throughout the country, there are now almost 80 such stations. The public, as we all know, has become an enthusiastic supporter of our great art. But even the boldest prophet in radio and the most ardent well-wisher certainly never foresaw any such condition as has existed for the past few months and exists right now. The only parallel to the radio business at the present time is the recent rush to the Texas oil fields, or the boom times of the motion picture industry some years ago. When the entire country is in the throes of depression, and with nearly every other industry that one can name running part-time or else is at an entire standstill, the radio business is the young giant that will soon rival such great industries as the automobile business, and this is not an idle prophecy. The entire radio industry was caught unprepared when the rush started last December. No one had foreseen such a thing, or thought such a condition could be possible. People stormed stores in their effort to buy radio apparatus, and anything from a $10 outfit to a $200 one found and is finding sales just as rapidly as the material can be delivered. During a single week, the writer has had on his desk correspondence, circulars, special letters, and telegrams, which show that over $5 million of new capital went into the radio business for the period of a single week. Every manufacturer is working at capacity day and night, trying to keep pace with the demand, and the more he turns out, the more he falls back. It makes no difference what he makes, whether it is a knob, a dial, a detector, or one of the expensive outfits. All find ready sale and overtax the capacity of every maker. The public seemingly does not care what it buys or what the price is, and as in any boom, it may be imagined that prices on radio goods are by no means low. In other words, the manufacturers and dealers are exacting top price. This condition is a natural one, when people are storming the stores and are lining up behind the showcases 6 deep and very often breaking the showcases in the bargain. All these are bare facts, but we are far from saying that such a condition is a healthy one. A situation of this kind is the worst that can be imagined, for many reasons. In the first place, it makes for loose manufacturing methods. Some of the manufacturers who have not been in the game very long do not care what sort of material they turn out. Inspection is apt to be lax, and many a layman who starts in the radio field today is disappointed, for the reason that he cannot get results. Such a man will give the entire radio business a black eye, and we would impress upon all manufacturers to rather curtail their sales and turn out workable instruments that will stand up, than make sales that will be a detriment to them later on. The other dangerous condition that has sprung up lately is the ill-famed stock-selling scheme. A manufacturer will get up a sample of a home radio outfit that looks like a Victrola and run a full-page advertisement of it in the daily papers. He has not a single outfit to sell, nor has he a plant in which to make them. Due to the boom conditions, he will get many orders for future delivery, and he will show these orders to his victims as a proof that his venture is a tremendously profitable one. He will get out circulars and begin selling stock, as has been done in the past, to the detriment of the entire radio art. When radio was young, several large concerns, as will be remembered, sold stock indiscriminately to the tune of many millions of dollars, out of which the public was defrauded. Due to this, the public for many years was wary of anything with the word wireless attached to it. As a result, the entire radio business suffered proportionately. It is to be hoped that such business methods will be exposed as quickly as they spring up, as the radio business cannot now afford such dishonest methods. The question which the writer is most often asked today is, how long will the boom last? When will the storm of prosperity blow over, leaving everyone prostrate with huge stocks on his hands? It is our opinion that the present conditions will last for at least another year, and that the radio business will be a very healthy one for several years to come. There will probably be the usual summer slack, although much less pronounced, and then a great rush for the fall and winter. The one thing regarding which we would caution dealers and jobbers is to be careful and not overbuy. Indications are that within the next 6 months there will be enough apparatus to go around. Tremendous efforts are being made by manufacturers to meet the situation, and with all the new capital being poured into the business, we estimate that within 6 months at the most, the supply will exceed the demand. In other words, everyone, unless he buys carefully, will be overstocked, and the usual hardships will follow. This not only holds true for the dealer who will find himself loaded with material on his shelves that he cannot move rapidly, but for the small manufacturer as well, who will have all his money tied up in merchandise for which the sale is not as brisk. We will then witness the next cycle, price cutting, when real competition will begin in earnest. This condition, however, is at least 6 months distant, and perhaps a little further. It is due to come, however, at any time for some of the supplies. But as mentioned before, the radio business in general should be brisk for some time to come, and those who can read the future best will no doubt reap the harvest. Dayton Police to Use Radio by Bert A. Teeters. Radio News, March 1922. Following a demonstration conducted by radio officials at McCook Field on December 31, 1921, authorities of Dayton, Ohio are contemplating the installation of municipal wireless equipment as an aid to the police department in combating crime. Under the tentative plans, a central station would be established at police headquarters, and 4 of the 5 police automobiles would be equipped with both sending and receiving apparatus. During the demonstration, Chief of Police J.N. Alabac rode about the city in an automobile equipped with receiving sets, and at all times was able to hear and understand distinctly matter transmitted by radiophone from McCook Field, several miles away. "I was able to hear every word spoken," said the chief in commenting on the demonstration, "and the messages were as distinct as any I have received over a telephone. I see great possibilities in the use of radio in the police department. We could relay messages to our machines in any part of the city, giving them vital information which might result in the prevention of a serious crime or the capture of a dangerous criminal. The radio sets would be especially valuable when the machines were out in the country searching for criminals, for it would permit the interchange of information and make capture more certain." The chief indicated his belief that use of radio in police work would be of greatest benefit when applied to rural patrol work. He pointed out that with a central station in the cities, rural patrols could operate in the country in automobiles, and be instantly available in case of any trouble. "The rural districts of the state could be blocked off in districts," said the police head, "and these districts could be patrolled by officers in automobiles, the same as our city streets are patrolled by policemen on beats. In case of any crime in any city, when the criminals fled into the country, the patrols could be notified by wireless, so they could lay in wait and capture the men. Such a system would greatly decrease the chances automobile bandits now have of making a getaway." Reporting news by radio, the latest achievement of the versatile radiophone. Radio News, October 1920. We knew it. The radiophone has at last entered commercial life with a vim which promises many future conquests. In this case, the radiophone recently stepped into newspaperdom via the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. In order to prove that the experiment is not a fallacy nor the product of journalistic imagination, 2 excellent photographs are reproduced on this page showing the 2 essential sides of the story. The lower illustration is none other than Mr. Ray T. Van Ettish, city editor of the Los Angeles Examiner, making use of a portable radiophone set. He is instructing reporter Chandler Sprague, who is in the country, miles away from the newspaper offices. In the upper photograph, we see Mr. Sprague in the very act of receiving instructions from his chief at the home office. To the right is shown Lieutenant J.T. Morris, Army radio officer of Marshfield, California. As may be noted by scrutinizing the apparatus, the United States Signal Corps installed the system. Major B.K. Yount, commanding officer of the field, cooperated with the newspaper in order to demonstrate to the public the possibilities of radio telephony. A complete radiophone installation was first erected in the Examiner Building, Los Angeles, California, and an extension brought down to the editor's desk. After this, the reporter and the radio officer left by automobile to cover various happenings. The first stop was Exposition Park, where the set was tested out at short range after having taken 10 minutes to set it up. This particular set having a working range of 20 miles, the next stop was Long Beach, where a newspaper story was corralled, and shortly thereafter the set was hastily installed in a vacant lot. 10 minutes later, the reporter was again in communication with his chief, and the story accordingly reported. A short time afterwards, the party set out for the amateur fishermen section of Santa Monica Bay, California. An interesting story was gleaned here owing to the fact that a fleet of professional fishing boats had come into the bay, and was seining for fish much to the dismay and indignation of those who were there for sport. Again, the installation was quickly set up, and headquarters was given the human interest fish story. No, curious reader, up to now we have not been informed as to who won priority fishing rights. The Examiner naively informs us that although the phone in this instance worked to perfection, the apparatus is a trifle cumbersome for use, except possibly in an emergency where the reporter expects to be miles away from a telephone. Incidentally, we are also informed that many experiments are being conducted whereby it is predicted that within a short time, the apparatus will be so simplified and condensed that a reporter can carry a portable radio phone set on any story, and use it to good advantage even in the heart of the city. We may thus conjure a newspaperman reporting a big fire, or a big flood, or a railroad wreck, or any other dire calamities by pressing a button in his pocket and talking through a small mouthpiece with his city editor downtown. These things are possible, but probably will not take place for many days to come. We must disappoint you. America is not the first to make use of the radiophone for reportorial work. The feat was recently accomplished by the London Daily Mail, and was reported as a complete success. In this case, the reporter toured the provinces of the big city in a motorcar and phoned in his stories to the editor in the heart of London by means of radio telephony. In this event, a Marconi 6-step amplifier was used at the receiving end. Incidentally, the first radiophone message spoken at sea on board a vessel destined for publication in a daily newspaper was received in the London Daily Mail office several weeks ago. The vessel happened to be the British SS Victorian, aboard which were delegates on their way to the Imperial Conference in Canada. The event occurred while the steamer was a considerable distance off the north coast of Ireland. Sir Campbell Stewart, managing editor, dictated a message from the deck of the liner to a reporter stationed at the Poldhu radio station in Cornwall. Here is what the reporter had to say concerning the important happening. I spoke through an ordinary telephone transmitter just as if I were calling a correspondent in the next town using the regular landline telephone. I said, "Hello, Victorian," and it was like calling a spirit from the deep to hear him reply on the instant, "Hello, Poldhu." We were just getting to conversation when a dramatic intervention took place. The whole atmosphere was charged with shrill pipings spelling out in the Morse code the seafarers' dreaded SOS. On the moment, the government station at the Lizard sent out a command to all operators to cease talking in order that there should be no hindrance to the transmission of the distressed vessel's message. Then, just as a moment before there had been nothing but shrill pipings from all quarters, there came a dead silence, through which there rose loud and clear the call of the distressed ship. She said she was the American vessel Coquet, and was in trouble off the Bishop Rock, Scilly Islands, and requiring immediate assistance. The Lizard took the matter in hand in a motherly fashion, arranged for the needed aid to be sent, and, this settled, the wireless world started talking again as if nothing unusual had occurred. These important events bring home to us the realization of the great importance of radiotelephony. While these two experiments were conducted more as test cases than with the intention of continuing them permanently, there is no doubt that within a short time, not only newspapers, but hospitals' ambulance service, police and fire departments, train and ship service, and countless other important organizations will recognize the value of the radiophone and make use of it practically and permanently. To this end, let us all work together, we who are in the radio field, towards the simplification of present systems. This will be a step in the right direction, as prospective users of the radiophone cannot be expected to spend months in learning the systems which are rather complicated when compared with the familiar and ever-ready land wire telephony. What the Farmer Listens to. Radio Broadcast, August 1926. The National Farm Radio Council has been making a nationwide survey of farms where radio sets are owned to find out just what the farmer wants to hear over the radio. The basis of this survey was a questionnaire of 18 questions. 25,000 of these questionnaires were sent out directly to farmers by the National Farm Radio Council, and many thousand more by other cooperating agencies such as agricultural publications, radio stations, and agricultural colleges. The resulting information, based on tabulation of 44,550 individual answers, has been compiled in an elaborate booklet, a copy of which we have recently received. The average urban listener doubtless has the impression, as had we, that the farmer is most interested in having himself uplifted and educated, for the reason, no doubt, that every program we hear announced as a special feature for farmers is of such uplifting or educating nature. But lo and behold, it seems the tired farmer, just as the tired businessman, is more eager to be entertained by his radio than taught. According to the survey, orchestra or band, educational talks, weather reports, market reports, and singing are the features with the greatest appeal. But first place is won by the orchestra, with farm talks trailing in second. Weather reports and market reports have about the same general appeal. A wide decline of interest is registered regarding vocal efforts. Some slight interest in church services and in the broadcasting of plays was shown. Other features did not excite sufficient interest to be charted. Under educational talks were classified talks by farm leaders, talks by agricultural production and marketing experts, convention speeches, and the like. While the orchestra and band were given first place, there was a general objection to jazz, and a general demand for more Hawaiian and old-time music. Vocal selections were not popular, and those who wanted vocal were carefully discriminatory. Male voices were preferred, particularly male quartets. A soprano voice found general disfavor among farm radio audiences. In some sections where radio stations have developed their own dramatic talent and real radio dramas are broadcast from the studios, genuine interest and approval was registered. News bulletins were in general demand. Radio as an important factor in the marketing of farm products was illustrated in the National Farm Radio Council survey by specific reports from 43 states. An amazing total of 46% of the replies gave specific examples of cash savings affected by the use of radio. Practically every report indicated the importance and value to the farmer of having market reports from 24 to 48 hours earlier than they are available through any other medium. A graphic account of just how this market information serves the farmer we cull from another source, a survey made by Kenyon W. Mix, representative of a New York radio manufacturer. A hog buyer from Kansas City visited a farmer at 9 o'clock one morning and offered him a certain price for a quantity of his hogs. The farmer and his wife demurred, complaining that the figure was too low. The buyer excused himself and rode off to another farm. 2 hours after, the farmer tuned his radio set and caught the 11 o'clock market quotations. The broadcast price for hogs was below the one offered by the departed buyer, so the farmer did some quick thinking. He knew the man was at another house a few miles up the road, so he called up by telephone, got in touch with him, and after saying that he needed some money and had decided to sell at the quoted terms, he closed a profitable deal. The buyer did not know of the sudden price change, and was held to his original quotation by the ethics of the business. In another case, I met a farmer who had for a neighbor a man he intensely disliked. The first farmer had a radio set, and the neighbor didn't. One day, while the former was listening to his receiver, he learned that the price of cabbages had gone up $20 a ton. Thereupon he went out, bought from his neighbor all the latter's available cabbage, at the old and lower price of course, and then resold at a healthy profit. The other man now also has a radio receiver in his living room. Can you hold with us for some further statistics? We have at hand the report of another survey which is interesting in that it so closely corroborates the above. This is a survey of more than 18,000 farm homes, which is being made by the farm women themselves, under the guidance of Mrs. Mary C. Punk of the Sears Roebuck Agricultural Foundation. The results were gathered by some 1,200 observers, each of whom studied carefully the conditions in a small group of homes in her own neighborhood. These are some of the conclusions. Although the silver-tongued salesman may sell the farmer his radio set as a business investment, once it is installed in the home, its chief function is entertainment as far as the man of the house is concerned. 25% of them prefer music to any other program. 24% are making the most of the practical side of radio, using them regularly to get the daily weather and market reports. This is especially true among Corn Belt farmers in Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, and Ohio, where 42% state that they rely almost entirely on weather and market information which their radio brings them. Down in the cotton country, both east and west of the Mississippi, farmers still prognosticate coming weather events by the look of the sky and the smell of the wind. 3% only give this as an important feature of their radio programs. Church and sports by radio make little appeal to the farmer, according to his wife's report on him, and he still prefers to get his political opinions firsthand at the general store. Farm women, as a rule, like the household homemakers programs best, for 41% tune in on these most frequently. 31% prefer musical programs, 8% want lectures, 1% are especially interested in farm talks on gardens and poultry, and 3% enjoy their radio most for the church services and sacred music it brings them. The thrifty housewives of New England poll the largest vote for the Homemaker's Hour, with its hints on economics and new recipes. Corn Belt farm wives run them a close second, probably due to the circumstances that these two sections are close to stations which specialize in programs of help and interest to rural homes. Farm women in the Tobacco Lands, Kentucky, and the Virginias will tune in on anything, just so it is music, and they likewise are the most enthusiastic about church and religious programs. Women in the cotton-growing states west of the Mississippi, like their husbands, enjoy the serious educational programs. 37% will always fish around in the ether after a lecture. But farm folk on the whole are not prone to be fussy about the kind of entertainment they can get over the air. 18% of the men and 16% of their wives refuse to state a preference because they like it all so well. The most radios are found in the New England states, New York and Pennsylvania, where they have invaded 38% of the homes. The Central Corn Belt, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio run a close second, 33%. But the Eastern Cotton States should be the radio salesman's paradise, for radio has found its way into only 3% of the homes. The very latest in radio sensations. Radio News, June 1922. Ed Wynn is very much worked up about radio, ever since his show was broadcasted some weeks ago. The Perfect Fool threatens to become a choice specimen of radio nut. Having carefully addressed what appeared to be a soup plate in place of an audience for about 2 hours, and having been assured that his voice was being carried to millions all over the United States, Ed simply had to find out what it was all about. He temporarily abandoned his statistical consideration of the number of people in the United States who prefer to eat with their knives and drink coffee out of their saucers to study a small primer on the art of radio. Of course, in a few days, this was child's play to him, and he is now launching forth in experiments which will undoubtedly revolutionize radio. He was recently found by a wandering cameraman in the strange attitude depicted in the illustration. In response to a request for information, he carefully explained that radio signals travel around the world 8 times a second, and that there is no reason why the waves started off on their mad career a few weeks ago by his voice should not still be dashing around the world. He was endeavoring to pick them up. He was not quite sure what he would do with them if he did pick them up, but there was some vague suggestion about using them for running his automobile or something. Mr. Wynn assured the cameraman, however, that the real reason for sitting on the radiator was to keep warm. The girls at Radcliffe College have developed a new thrill. The life of the college girl, in spite of all its little intricacies and complications, was threatening to become dull. How can a flapper properly and efficiently flap if things are so terribly apparent? Conversation over the telephone with a stander who probably had his coat lapel adjusted to show the official badge of membership used to provide a slight sensation, but the wire telephone is so obvious, don't you know? The radiophone has solved all of this. The girls in the illustration have just connected by radio with someone who has the loveliest voice, and they are trying to decide what he looks like. He says he is an amateur, and that doesn't sound quite so interesting, although now and then it is rather amusing. One of the girls won't be satisfied until she hears an aviator talking. She had a flurry for aviators during the war, and she wants to hear what they sound like over the radiophone. The girls have provided themselves with quite a wicked-looking apparatus too, and they insist they know all about it. How it feels to face a microphone for the first time. Radio broadcast, July 1927. Many articles have been written on this subject, but none has afforded us more amusement or seemed to more accurately portray the situation than that written by Francis Hackett, the Irish novelist, for the Radio Times, London. A few paragraphs culled from the midst of others equally droll. In the studio, there is perfect silence. You must begin, and for 2 instants you are struck by a dumb futility. How do you know that anyone is listening? This audience is a blank. It is inanimate. It cannot clap or boo or say "hear, hear." For all you know, everyone has gone away to dinner, and you are about to chatter to the void. This thick suspicion is so unbearable that you brace yourself to believe in something totally outside your experience. It is like a dive. In the way that a diver must say goodbye to his springboard and launch his body into the air, so must you pass from the sure footing of silence and launch into speech. With a rushing and breathless celerity, you give your words to space, and what you are saying flicks by you unrecognized, like telegraph poles from a train window. This is a strange confusion. You know you have actually begun to speak, but what exactly you are expressing, what the words are conveying, is not in your grasp. In the first moments, you have more sensations than you can deal with. This plunge is headlong, dizzying, and obliterating. You have broken with the habit of a lifetime, have lost the earth. Whenever before you have spoken in public, you have had your victims before you. They looked at you, you looked at them. They coughed if you bored them, and when they fell asleep, you could enjoy their peaceful expression. After the first 5 minutes, what you want to say really takes possession of your mind, and you definitely want to communicate to these invisible listeners exactly what you have felt. As this conviction mounts, the act of speaking becomes more natural and more amusing. You are not courageous enough to look at the clock, which is glaring at you from the right, and you dare not look away from the microphone lest it should turn its back on you. The dive is over. You are no longer gulping the water and gasping. You begin to time your strokes, to find a rhythm, to swim. And as you do this, the futility of your own ideas gradually becomes less apparent. You actually convince yourself that what you are saying is not so idiotic. Then the pleasure of speaking to invisible listeners begins to gain on you. Can they escape from you? You don't believe it. The disease which attacks all speakers seizes on you, verbal elephantiasis. Your words begin to swell. You feel you have a great deal more to say, and you turn away so that the ugly, sour-faced clock can no longer see you. Several athletic young men loom up at this point and make formidable gestures. You plead, they threaten, they drag you away. Girl solves Izzy's problem. Radio Digest, February 27th, 1926. Dizzy Izzy was serious. He had a problem. Even to try to be a radio clown and be compelled to worry along with a problem on your neck is enough to make anyone serious. Things were always coming up, and Dizzy Izzy had to put them down, or he would forget them. It made no difference that he had Mike at WOAW Omaha in front of him and all the woodmen of the world back of him. There are lots of things in this world that stump even woodmen, and the problem stumped Dizzy Izzy. Once he turned the microphobia upside down and stuck his finger against a hot wire when the problem seemed to present itself there. 400 sets went dead. Dizzy explained to a twisting audience that a crystal crab in Lincoln had snapped at the end of his finger and made the blood come. Still, the problem haunted him. It crept out of his subconscious mind at all sorts of inopportune times, and shinned up the microphone stand like a diabolical imp to taunt and prod him. What was it? What did it all mean? What was income tax, philosophy, ethics, poetry, breakfast, matrimony, world court, zero, music, the Einstein theory, higher mathematics, theology, static, 100%, 18th Amendment? These questions all seemed to be a part of his problem. They streamed through his mind as he nestled into a one-armed chair in Thompson's restaurant and drained the dregs of a loco weed sandwich. His meditations were interrupted. A freakish-looking girl with long hair done up in the old-fashioned way and skirts that came an inch below her knees approached with a glass of milk and a Bismarck. Without even noticing Dizzy, she settled down cozily in the harbor across the arm of his chair. She tilted her glass of milk, and Dizzy noticed that her throat was as white as the fluid she drank, even whiter. Her long lashes caressed her cheeks lovingly. Her slim, wax-like fingers had the daintiest hint of rosebud pink. Dizzy admired the classic elevation of her alabaster brow. Suddenly, he felt a surging desire to speak to her, to confide in her, to ask her advice as to his problem. Here was one who surely would understand. He licked the last drop of the loco weed sandwich from the bowl and turned tremblingly toward the young woman. "Pardon me, miss," he stammered, taking his turtle shell specs from his eyes and wiping a green fog from the lenses with his paper napkin. "I hope you will pardon my idiosyncrasy in speaking to you, but I have a very, very serious problem, a very difficult problem." "I'm not a school teacher, but I guess you are harmless. What is it?" She calmly broke her Bismarck. "Well, I've been thinking of the meaning of things. Everything, you know." "For instance, what?" Wiping a bit of red jelly from her dainty chin. "Oh, just for example, we'll say love, matrimony, divorce, domestic—" "Easy, old fellow. It's easy. The whole thing is just blah." Crash! Dizzy's double-duty turtle shell specs fell from his nerveless fingers and broke into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, he half stood and half sat as a man awaking from a long dream. Slowly, his scattered senses mobilized between his ears. His naked eyes filled with tears. "I see it all, now," he gasped hoarsely. "You are right. That is the answer. You shall hear from me again. You have performed a great public service, for I am none other than Dizzy Izzy, the announcer. The world is waiting to know. I shall bear the message. To me will go the honor, but I will not forget. Eureka! The Blah Club." And that, boys and girls, was the true answer to Dizzy Izzy's problem. Never again was he serious. What became of the young lady? Well, that is another story. But you have all heard of the Great Blah Club of WOAW. There are 35,000 registered members and a waiting list of 25,000 more, and it is so exclusive that anyone who doesn't care to will not be admitted to membership. It has been 3 months now since Dizzy Izzy officiated at the first initiation ceremonies. Males and females over 16 years old are called boobs and boobuses, respectively. All members under 16 are called boobies. Every candidate must ride Brindle Betsy thrice around the Red Barn to the tintabulation of the bovine lavalier. When it comes to dismounting, the candidate is royally knighted by a barrel stave saber in the hands of Dizzy Izzy and his court, which consists of Cy Perkins, Gus, Ulfred Jessen, Bill Goodrich, Eddie Stewart, and Mac Omen. The Blah Club takes the air from Podunk Center, remote control over barbed wire. The club rooms are in Cy Perkins' general store and undertaking parlors. The Blah Club has included such entertainers as Jack Little and Lou Ferris, the Eiffel Tower of radio. The slogan is, "A little nonsense now and then is relished by the wisest men." There are many features. One is the Matrimonial Bureau, which hunts mates for spinsters and bachelors. A Lost and Found department is maintained for stray animals. There is a Raz Bureau for the knockers. Many interesting letters are received from prospective members. Some excerpts follow. "Dear Izzy," writes an applicant for membership, "I want to be inducted into the mighty Blah Club. I feel that if I were a member, I would have more fun. You will need to kick the cow good and hard when you take me in. I am a church, not a schoolhouse. I have got a rather high standing, and there isn't much in my belfry. I have a good many members and more than one organ. Yes, you can knock the cow, bell and all, over if you want to. Your old radio fan, Dwight Church." Another, offering his pedigree for membership, says, "I am an evolutionist, old enough to grandfather in 2 places. Eat all I can get, but can't sleep on account of listening in. Work when I have to. Walk on my hind feet, and I'm a little lame in the head. Otherwise, my better half says I am all right. Don't forget friend wife. Give her all the cowbells and head the critter north by east. Recommend that the Blah Club members appropriate some to rebuild the Kansas depot that the woodpeckers knocked down. Respectfully, O.J. Pruitt." Political blah is provided by Senator Snag of Podunk Center. This is the mysterious secret password that gets you by the ether waves. Blah. Tolerating Jazz. Radio broadcast, August 1927. Various readers of this department have belabored us for what they call our leniency toward jazz. But if leniency is not the attitude to adopt toward jazz, we do not know what is. There is no use getting mad at it. It is no unnatural, monstrous thing to be shunned like a two-headed dog, but a perfectly normal manifestation of the present age. Jazz, as jazz, is no more reprehensible than a hot dog. Hence our failure to rant against it periodically. To be sure, we should not like to have a steady diet of jazz any more than we would like to have a steady diet of hot dogs. But there are times when the lowly weenie hits a spot that even a sirloin smothered in onions cannot reach. There is still too much jazz on the radio, we grant, especially in the hinterlands. But fortunately, most of it occurs at hours when good folk have gone to bed, so it bothers us not. Those who like jazz are, we believe, entitled to it, and are not to be too much reviled for liking it. Those who understand real music realize, as no jazz addict ever can, that jazz is indeed a namby-pamby substitute for music. But, by way of vindicating them, list to what Paul Whiteman says in an article contributed to the New York Times Magazine. "I sincerely believe that jazz is the folk music of the machine age. There was every reason why this music sprang into being about 1915. The acceleration of the pace of living in this country, the accumulation of social forces under pressure, and long before the war too, mechanical inventions, methods of rapid communication, all had increased tremendously in the past 100 years, notably in the past quarter century. In this country especially, the rhythm of machinery, the over-rapid expansion of a great country endowed with tremendous natural energies and wealth, have brought about a pace and scale of living unparalleled in history. Is it any wonder that the popular music of this land should reflect these modes of living? Every other art reflects them. Like the folk songs of another age, jazz reflects and satisfies the undeveloped aesthetic and emotional cravings of great masses of people. Such music in any age has not been entirely negligible. Jazz is a spirit, not a manner. Crude, unmusical perhaps, but as healthily vulgar and sincere as were the vulgarities of the Elizabethan age, the music of an uneducated, vigorous man struggling ungrammatically to express his response to the age in which he is living. Since when in music have these forms of music been pronounced dead and worth ignoring? If you've made it to the end of this very, very long video, I have to say I'm a bit surprised, but thank you. And as a reward, here's a bonus picture just for you. I found this a while back and I just don't get it. Well, anyway, I hope you have a nice day or night.